I'd like to call the work session of Monday, June 7th, Williamsburg City Council to order. Ms. Felica, if you'd call the roll, please.
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Ms. Ramsey.
Here.
Mayor Pons.
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent.
Here.
Mr. Maslin.
Here.
Thank you. So that takes us to items for City Council meeting June 10th. First, we have council preview. Mr. Trivett.
Yeah, so on the agenda for Thursday, we have the adoption of the budget. The fire station comprehensive agreement is ready for council to consider. The economic development plan COVID update, which you're going to hear about more about today. Selection of financial policies we'd like to see the council adopt, and a trash cart ordinance.
Thank you. Any questions for the city manager? So that takes us to the public comment portion of the meeting, and I have several speakers card here. When I get through these cards, if anybody else would like to come forward, just please come forward to the microphone. And when you do come forward, please state your name and address, and please limit your comments to 5 minutes. So we'll begin with Mr. John Strong.
Thank you. My name is John Strong. I live at 321 Burns Lane. I wanted to speak about the property tax assessment proposal. According to the land bank records and the current assessments from the city website, taxable assessed values in the city have increased from $1.865 billion in fiscal 2019 to $1.989 billion in fiscal 20 to $2.058 billion in fiscal 21. With the current tax rate of 60 cents, this has meant that property tax collections have risen from 11.2 million to 12.3 million in the past 2 years. This is an increase of 9.8%. The letter to taxpayers from the city manager dated March 17, 2021, proposed an 8-cent increase, later revised to 6 cents. If implemented, this 6-cent increase would generate an additional $1.3 million of property tax collections, which would represent a 21.4% increase since 2019. Moreover, this does not include any additional increase in assessed values, which, given the recovery in housing markets, would further increase the tax burden. The increased revenues are proposed to be used for stabilization of the general fund and the capital improvement program. I'd like to raise 3 issues with the proposed uses. First, I've long been a supporter of the city policy to hold reserves in a rainy day fund of 35% of operating revenues. It's not clear from the city manager's letter how far we are below the 35%, just that the city anticipates using about $4 million of this fund. I don't understand why a property tax increase should bear a disproportionate share of any COVID replenishment, nor why a permanent increase in property taxes is required to replenish this fund. This would seem to be a good use of American Recovery Act funding if it is permitted. Even without federal funding, the proposed fiscal 22 budget includes transfers from the general fund to the tourism fund, assumes no revenue from the Prince George parking garage, and includes expenditures for a 4th lighted softball field at Kiwanis Park for hoped-for speculative tournaments. Second, the city's capital improvement program totals $64.2 million, of which more than half is for 5 projects: the fire and police stations, the library, and the Lafayette Street and Capitol Landing Road projects. The library renovation and expansion, totaling $8.2 million in the CIP for 2024 to 26, is quite vague in its description, including language that says, quote, with the extent to engage in discussions with James City and York counties about a joint facility. We appear to be committing to tax increases to fund a project which is not well defined or committed at this point. Third, the city manager letter states that the property tax increase is needed to allow the city to cash finance rather than borrow the city's share of WJCC school projects. Of the WJCC school CIP, which totals $71 million, about 45% is slated for construction of a new elementary school and major capital investments at the 3 high schools. While ongoing maintenance and repair projects at the school system sort of might be cash financed, I don't understand why the city's 9.6% share of WJCC CIP should be cash financed, since the new elementary school will last for decades. These are investments whose costs should be equitably shared over their lives. As such, it's appropriate to ask why a significant proportion of the city's $6.8 million share is not a good candidate for additional bond finance. The city has a sound policy goal of keeping debt service to less than 10 to 12% of general fund expenditures and borrowings to less than 2.75 to 3% of assessed values. The CIP shows forecast contingencies in debt service as just under $2 million for fiscal '21, rising to just under $3 million by fiscal '26. Given city general fund expenditures on the order of $40 million, there would appear to be ample debt capacity without affecting bond ratings to fund school CIP needs with bond finance rather than cash financing sourced from increases in property taxes. As other city residents have commented, we face uncertainty about the amount and use of federal funds. Both the financing sources and the proposed uses of proceeds raise questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strong. Next card I have is Debbie Schaefer, Williamsburg Area Restaurant Association. Welcome.
Thank you for allowing me to speak this afternoon. I am Debbie Schaefer, and our address in Williamsburg, Virginia is Post Office Box 3072 with zip 23187. I am here on behalf of the Williamsburg Area Restaurant Association. We currently have 112 members in our association. And I'm proud to tell you today that not one of our members, not one of them, closed due to COVID. Now, if you look at Virginia Beach and Richmond around us, there were restaurants that were forced to close due to COVID. Our restaurants have struggled. They have been as creative as they possibly could be. They've reached out to hold hands with each other. They've lifted each other, and they've done everything they can. I feel at this time with your proposed tax increase that it's not fair to the restaurants at this time. And it's not that we're against a tax increase, we're certainly not. But our restaurants have struggled so much over the past year. They're barely getting a breath right now. I'm sure you all know how shorthanded everybody is. We can't even seat an entire restaurant to create the revenue for that restaurant at this time. We have restaurants that are opening later in the day, closing earlier in the evening, closing an extra day during the week because they can't staff. So we allow us to get back on our feet before you impose such a tax. I took the time last week and I went out and visited quite a few people in the restaurant area around the town. And within the city of Williamsburg, you might like to know that 49% of our 112 members are within the city of Williamsburg. So the majority of our members are within your great city of Williamsburg. So maybe some of these people you might know: Old City Barbecue, the Jefferson Restaurant, Mama Steve's, Cafe Seafair, Route 60, None Other Pancake House, Outback, La Terraza, Sal's by Victor, Colonial Pancake House, Capitol Pancake House, Rio Brava, Copper Fox, Blue Talon Bistro, Dog Street Pub, La Piazza, Blackbird Bakery, Aromas, Corner Bakery, Houndtail, Retros, Cheese Shop, Fat Canary Downstairs, Mellow Mushroom, Amber Ox, The Bake Shop, Precarious Beer Hall, Paul's Deli, College Deli, Greenleaf, Culture Cafe, 2nd Street Bistro. That's just to name a few. Not a one of these people that I talked to was for the tax increase at this time. Everybody understands that taxes will be increased, but we just ask you, please, think about it twice and let's move it back a little bit. Let your restaurant industry recover a little bit more. The healthier we are, the healthier our entire community is, and the more taxes, the more revenue the city will end up receiving from our businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schaefer. Next speaker card I have is Charles Glazner. Good afternoon, sir.
How are you?
Well, thank you.
I'm Charlie Glazner. I live at 319 South Boundary Street in Williamsburg. I sent an email earlier to you. I trust the rest of the group got it as well as the city manager.
Yes, sir.
I'd first like to start by saying that not all the information has come in yet on what's going to happen financially, and there's really not any urgency here. Time is not of the essence. It's been rumored that the city is going to get up to $15 million in aid as a result of this pandemic. Even if it was half that much, it's a lot of money. And if we don't know how much it is, there's no sense moving forward if one doesn't have to. The city of Newport News said they're going to run a $5 million budget. City of Newport News. Tax revenues in almost every sector are, increasing. As far as the real estate tax goes, we all know our properties are appreciating, and even if the rate stays the same, our taxes go up. Then you increase the rate, you get a double whammy. That's just not right. And it's not right because the people that are going to feel it the most are the ones that have really borne the brunt of this pandemic. It's not affluent people that pay the price. And there aren't that many of them. It's the more modest income people. That's not a good thing to do. The city manager at the last meeting talked about areas where he looked into to cut the budget, and they reduced the budget. I'd like to know what that was. I'd like to know where you explored the proposed budget, where you subtracted, and where you eliminated. A few things that I've come up with. First thing is, we're not buying any more vehicles. I drive by a parking lot by the city building 3 or 4 times a week. There are 2 9 or 12 passenger vans parked there all the time. There's actually a third one that appeared today when I went by before this meeting. We don't need 3 vans. We may need a van once in a while. Call Enterprise Rent-A-Car and rent one. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to put gas in it. You don't have to insure it. You don't have to maintain it. I don't know what a van costs, but 30,000 times 3 is, you do that a couple of times and pretty soon you've saved some money. Hiring of employees. We don't need to be hiring any more employees. You got to do more with less. And then there's always temporary employees. Somebody told me in the budget, they've got a temporary employee at $55,000 a year. Jesus. Repaving of roads. This is a favorite of mine. When we built our house on Newport and South Boundary Street, no sooner had we finished the house than they paved Newport Avenue. Newport Avenue did not need to be paved. A couple years later, they paved South Boundary Street. South Boundary Street doesn't need to be paved. They just paved Old Route 5, I don't know what the name of it is now, out by Walsingham. They just paved that. That didn't need to be paved. Pave roads when roads need to be paved. I asked a past elected official of the city about that years ago, and he said, we have a policy to pave the roads every so often. Why don't we test drive paving roads when roads need to be paved? Is there something wrong with that? Parking meters. Colonial Williamsburg's even come to Jesus. They've already got one lot with you got to do some app or something to park in there. And they're redoing 2 more. Jesus. You know why? There's money in parking. You read in the newspaper where all the diplomats in New York City don't pay their parking fines. It adds up to millions of dollars a year. There is money in parking. I think there are a lot of people that are working for the city right now who've been here way too long. They're way eligible for retirement. They need to go. They need to help us out and retire. And the last thing is, there are a lot of people that work for the city that see the city spending money and know they got common sense. They realize we don't need 25 new pickup trucks. There are more trucks over there in that parking lot, the city's parking lot and the thing behind it where they maintain them, than Casey Chevrolet's got. That's too many vehicles.
Thank you, Mr. Glazer. Time's expired. Appreciate you coming forward, though. Next speaker's card I have is Mickey Shohan. Good afternoon, sir.
Mayor, members of City Council, my name is Mickey Chohan. I live at 129 Berkeley Lane. Most recently, I've been living a lot at 142nd Street because we're a little short on staff. So I'm able to be with you today because we're closed on Mondays. So I am able to catch up on some repair and maintenance. But outside of that, the restaurant industry is not as glitzy and glamorous as it has been the last of my 36 years. So I think all of us restaurateurs are working harder now than ever before because we're supplementing what we don't have, and that's staffing. So I didn't come to talk about staffing so much, but I did want to address your role as in leadership, because it'll take every one of you to make the decisions of passing this budget. And in passing this budget, I would request that you strongly look at and reconsider what I think I understand is staff's still recommendation to increase property tax 6 cents. And I just find it outlandish that you would even consider increasing the property tax if, from my understanding as well, is that there's $15 million coming in the Recovery Act that will well take care of any deficits that we might have. I know that money has some ties to it of what you can do and can't do, but I'm sure there's some things in the budget that you can pull out and reallocate some of these funds so you don't have to do what's already a difficult question. That is burden the businesses and residents with this added tax. What has been said already is that the tax situation of our businesses is very, very untimely and unwelcomed. I'm appreciative that we've had the opportunity of delaying the vote to this week because I think it's given us some clarity on revenue, income side, and expense side. And I can clearly see, whereas I understand the mechanics of the budget and how you have to allocate for different expenses coming forward, but I also think I understand that the school project has been delayed, and that would be some extra found monies that wouldn't need to be in the budget right now. The city has done some awesome and incredible things, but at the same token, in doing some of those great things, we don't need a reversal of some of those great things. I know B-poll tax was generously offered back to the businesses. I think it was one of the council members that mentioned that last time, but remember what B-poll tax is. B-poll tax is a tax on the business sales volumes that you're doing. If you weren't doing it, you deserved a rebate anyway. So where it seems like it was generous, it was really the right thing to do. So I applaud the city for doing the right thing. Well, here's an opportunity to do, once again, the right thing. And that is pump the brakes a little bit and step down. We already have some money on the way, and it doesn't have to come to the expense of the businesses and the residents as well. Thank you very, very much for your service. I know the time commitment that it takes to run your positions, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker's card I have is David Cranbuell. Well, so this would be the opportunity, sir. Yeah, the next open forum would be after the discussion. I'm sorry if I confused you before the meeting.
Cranbuell. I live at 201 Harrison. I own a rental house at 206 Harrison, so I pay property taxes twice. And I'm a significant investor in the Ely Cafe, which it gets involved in taxes as well. I appreciate the thoughts of the people who preceded me. We all have our own opinions, but my feeling is that the real estate tax is inappropriately low in the city. It benefits, most of all, the people with doing very well businesses. And I think I see at the Ely Cafe, we're doing fine. We're not doing great, but we're doing fine. We're above water. And our manager and owner, who you know, is totally in favor of this increase. Works two places. And so I think some of this is a little bit overstated, to say the least. Basically, the property tax here is far lower than Isle of Wight, as our manager and owner at the Ely Cafe said, and they don't even begin to provide the services that we have here. We need taxes to provide those services and for the CIP and all the things that's been carefully thought out by our city manager. And the property tax is one of the lowest percentages in the area, in the state, and in the United States. And with this increase, we will be able to help those businesses, as you've done very well during this time. And you need revenue to help people. Now, I don't know about this 15 million, and I don't know how it relates exactly to the numbers of the tax increase. But, I mean, if we need a wait to see if we have 15 million coming from Washington, that's fine with me, although we can't wait forever. But assuming things are as we thought they would be, then I strongly support this tax, because those of us in $500,000 plus houses are getting a tax break in living here. And I think we should pay for it. And the people at the Ace Hardware store, where he returned several $100,000 in PPP money because he's doing great, there are a lot of people doing great. And so we need this tax to help those that aren't doing great. So I don't disagree with that. But basically, I think it's been very well thought out. And aside from huge amounts of money possibly coming from Washington, I think you should follow through with it so it brings up greater equity into where the money for this city comes from sales, meals, lodging, and real estate. The real estate portion tax rate is the lowest I've ever seen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next speaker's card I have is Stuart Godden. Welcome, sir.
Hi, how are you? Stuart Godden, 715 Goodwin Street. Glad to be back in person. I just don't see it on the tax increase, the resident tax increase. We have this large amount of money coming. It could be, as some say, up to $15 million. And as stated earlier, even if it's half, $7.5 million. What are we going to do with it? Where are we going to spend that money? Is it just going to be a slush fund someplace? I don't know. So given that, let's see how much we have. It's more than enough already. I don't think we need a tax increase at all. And just as a point of equity, some people like myself, we've enjoyed a good stock market. We're doing okay. There are a lot of other people in the city who aren't in the market and are not doing very well. They've lost jobs. They've seen reduced income. This is not the time to hit them with a 10% property tax increase plus another 3 or so percent on the assessment increase. So that's an increase of 13%. I would strongly counsel time to wait. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So that is all the speaker's cards I have, but if anybody else would like to come forward, please step forward and state your name and address, please.
Hello, I'm Steve Sealing from 4108 Longview Landing. I own Aromas with my wife. I wanted to reiterate what Debbie and Mickey had said before. We understand that the city needs at some point most likely to increase taxes. But at the present time, it's not the right time. Many of the restaurants in town are barely making it right now. They've had, the last year of money just flying out the door. And they're finally starting to be able to make some money right now. But they can't hire staff because there aren't people to work. So as Debbie mentioned, places are closing early, or they have reduced hours. So they're already not able to make what they're doing. We at Aromas, I think we're doing fairly well. Are we back to where we were? By no means. Our busiest days at Aromas, we are still probably 30% below what our busiest days are. And I don't see it coming back in the next couple of months, because to get to the numbers that we had means we have to pack people in, and people just aren't ready to do that. It's a situation where it's just going to take time. We also have an issue where in May, the minimum wage was increased. Does that affect us a lot this time around? May a little bit here and there. But again, we've got another minimum wage increase coming in January, and then another one coming the January after that. For many of these restaurants who are on just a razor-thin budget, anything else that we're having to pay is really hurting our bottom line. So, to add these extra things when, labor is going to increase by 25, 30, possibly much more than that by the time minimum wage is fully implemented. And that really affects restaurants a lot more than many other businesses. So I would ask that you think about those things, that, a delay just right now is not the time. We're just starting to come out and just starting to make money. And to get hit with extra fees right now when we're just trying to dig ourselves out is difficult, and it's hard for all of us to take. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am. Welcome.
Probably because I'm such a shorty. I'm Cynthia Baker, and I live at 89 Governor Berkeley Road. And my points, I want to reiterate some points that have already been said, but I just think this is untimely. We have a significant number of retirees in our community, as you know, and they've had to spend down their resources as a result, even though they didn't really get the stimulus like a lot of people. And there are other industries besides the restaurant industry that have been affected. I was really shocked that my industry was affected. I work in research, mostly phase 1 research, and they use normal, healthy volunteers. And I hadn't worked since last January because the clinics were closed, and also they couldn't get volunteers. I had a study that I was thinking I was going to do in April, but that was canceled because they couldn't get the volunteers, quote unquote, due to the generous stimulus package, and that study was moved to Canada. So these studies that I do are required by the FDA, and they're new drugs. So this has had an impact on new drugs coming to market because of the delay in trying to get the research done. So I just want you to realize there are other industries that have been affected, and it's just untimely, I think, and it'd be good to see how far the state and federal resources will go before you raise the property taxes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Liebler. Welcome.
I'm Jacqueline Liebler with 1430 High Street, Suite 706. I'd like to thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of the City Council. I'm also speaking on behalf of WARA. I was lucky to have the opportunity to be nominated and elected as the president, and through this, during the past year, has been I'm trying to think the best way to describe it. It's just been a community built within a community. I've had the opportunity to speak to several restaurant owners and businesses, and hearing his story was amazing because our goal is that everyone's going to flourish and do incredible, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that happens. Though we face several challenges, one being in itself, just as we've said before, with unemployment, just not be able to get staffing, as a lot of people across the board have experienced. In addition, with minimum wage, though it was needed, it just was another wave that we had to encounter with the $9.50 and then the additional one coming up in January. And then with meat prices and chicken prices, that has increased, which has also been something that has caused us to increase prices that you have to then pass on to the guest coming in, which sometimes they don't understand. So with this additional tax increase, I understand it needs to be done. We just are looking at different options if it's either a small amount over several years or it could be deferred. I always believe you don't come in with a problem and point it out. You come up with a solution. And I believe many people here today had brought that to this room. And I'm hoping that it is becoming something that everyone can take into consideration. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, ma'am. Would anybody else like to come forward? Yes, sir.
Afternoon. Thank you for what you do. My name is Frank White. I'm at 110 Shirley Avenue. I would also like to mimic quite a few people here to ask that you might table this, waiting to see the money you got from the federal government. I understand there are expenses and things that come up, but I think in some ways it might be the cart ahead of the horse. I also have a procedural question. Can I ask about something else or strictly on this budgetary issue?
You can speak about anything you like.
Okay, well.
We don't get in, and we don't respond to questions necessarily, but we'd be happy to have.
I was going to say, I've talked to quite a few visa students at William & Mary who are interested at working in restaurants but feel their visa does not allow them to do so. I was thinking if someone, maybe this is for the city attorney, could address this in Richmond, this would help more than just this town. It might help Virginia Beach and quite a few other places. I don't know the original intention of why the visa was done that way, but I've talked to quite a few that would like to work. And even if it was 150, I think you could ask the restaurants in this town. They would welcome that. And also, I wanted to recommend maybe do some sort of high school open house on getting kids summer jobs to kind of impress upon them, because there are a lot of places hurting. Virginia Beach, they literally, hell, they'd hire me. But thank you for what you do. Please give this consideration. Like I said, my argument is, why put the cart ahead of the horse? See what you're going to get from the government and then make a decision. Thank you.
Maybe Mr. White can connect with Ms. Schaefer, talk about those visa students. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, we will close the public comment portion of the meeting, and which will take us to background presentations and discussions. The first we have Architectural Review Board Design Review Guidelines. Welcome, ma'am.
Good afternoon. It's been a little while since I've stood before you. It's good to see everybody in person. Today, I just want to kind of bring council up to speed on where we stand with the design review guideline update. We started this process, what seems like a different era, and met with council in early 2020, and kind of got some feedback from council and had a joint meeting with the ARB members. And from that meeting, we just dove right into the process. And March 9th, just before everybody went home, we held an ARB meeting to discuss AP1. And the feedback we received from council in our joint work session at the beginning of that year was that AP1 was good, and we were satisfied with where we were. And so ARB is not recommending any changes at this time for AP1. And then the world came to a close. So we stopped meeting because we recognized the importance of making sure that everyone had the opportunity to provide input. And we knew that not everybody was comfortable using the Zoom meeting feature, and not everybody can kind of get their point across in a virtual setting. So we put it on hold. When things picked back up last year, we had a few meetings and took care of some other things in the design review guidelines. This was when we had limitations on space and the number of people we could have in the building. So we talked about signs, and we talked about rehabilitation and demolition and things like that. We've held off to this point talking about AP2, AP3, and the Corridor Protection District. What the board wanted to do was to have a materials showcase to give the opportunity for the public to come and look at some new materials and to kind of give us a little bit of feedback on what they thought. I have received one additional email since that meeting of another product that a resident is interested in using, so I'm going to share that information with the board. But at our meeting in May, we had approximately 50 folks. It was right out here, and we did it outside, trying to make sure that we could make it as open as possible for as many people as possible. We had a few vendors that were there. One was presenting a new window, and one was presenting a new siding material. Other materials that we had available and some information that we had included siding, trim, decking, doors, and other windows. The rest of our schedule, now that we're kind of back into the swing of things, we're going to start with AP2, and that meeting is going to be on July 12th. It will be in this room. We recognize that that's the largest district we have, and so we expect a lot of feedback and a larger turnout. We are going to be sending out postcards to every single property owner in AP2, and hopefully they'll be going out this week. So once we get that information out, we will make sure that we have everything published in advance. The staff draft for those guidelines will be published in advance on the city website, and then we'll have our meeting. We're going to do the same thing for AP3. It's a little bit of a smaller district, and we have a conflict with this room that day, so we'll likely hold it across the hallway, which is where we're currently holding our ARB meetings, and it's a large space, so I feel comfortable that we'll be able to accommodate the folks in attendance at that meeting. After those meetings, we would like to have a joint work session with City Council. ARB feels that at that point we'll have had enough feedback from the residents and the property owners in those districts that we can kind of see, where we think we're headed and see where council thinks we should be going. And at that point, we'll be able to have those conversations a little bit better than if we were to have them right now. Following that, we have the Corridor Protection District with both commercial and residential. There's not a whole lot of residential property in the Corridor Protection District, but there are some, and then that will cover both existing and new construction. After that, staff gets to work putting it together in a nice, pretty package, and it'll go to public hearing at the ARB in October, and then Planning Commission in November, and hopefully before this body in December. To kind of bring you where we're thinking and where we're going, AP2, like I said, is the largest district we have in town, and it encompasses a large variety of areas, most areas that are surrounding the historic district downtown. And it includes Braxton Court, West Williamsburg Heights, College Terrace, Indian Springs, and then portions of Burns Lane, Carey Street, Griffin Avenue, Newport, Boundary, Colonial Extension, Tyler Court, Capitol Heights. There's a lot of residential areas in AP2, and that's why we do expect that to be a fairly large meeting. AP3 is a little bit smaller, and we had a brief discussion about AP3 at our last ARB meeting. It includes West Williamsburg, Crispus Attucks, Pinecrest, and Capitol Court. One of the things we're looking into is AP3 is kind of an interesting mix of housing. We have some houses that were built pre-World War II and some houses that were built post-World War II. And we're looking at that date because there is a notable change in materials produced to accommodate the housing boom that occurred after World War II. And so one of the thoughts that we're having is reviewing the actual materials that are in place in the existing structures we have in the city. In AP2, we have 464 structures. 209 of those were built before World War II. In AP3, we have 156 structures, and only 47 of those were built before World War II. So it's a significantly smaller percentage. Staff did a windshield survey of the structures in AP3, and by windshield survey, we kind of drove around and took a look at things, along with the information provided to us from the property or the tax assessment office. And so what we found were in those 47 structures that were built before 1946, 20 of those contain the true divided light wood windows, and we know that that has been a point of discussion both at ARB and before this body. 2 have a combination of true divided light wood windows and another material. One of them, I believe, was probably vinyl, and the other one may be an aluminum clad. 21 have modern windows. I've used the term modern windows to note that they are not true divided light wood windows. Some of them may be vinyl, some of them may be aluminum clad, some of them may be vinyl clad, but they're not true divided light wood windows. 3 have windows where I was not able to determine what they were. Either they were behind storm windows, and so it was kind of hard to tell, or the material was difficult to figure out. And 1 actually has actual silver aluminum windows, which we don't see a lot of anymore. If we go to the siding material for those structures, the 47, 20 of them have vinyl siding. Only 10 have wood siding. 8 have asbestos. 3 have aluminum. 3 have brick. 2 have a combination that does not include wood. I think both of those were a vinyl and a brick. And 1 has hardy plank or cementous siding. So what we can note is, of those structures that are in that area, that we still hold to a pretty high standard in the design review guidelines. There's not a lot that have true original materials. And so the thought process, without receiving feedback yet, and I do anticipate we'll receive feedback yet, is that we will probably be able to provide some flexibility in AP3. And the kind of path that we're looking at is our board members recognize that cost and affordable housing is an issue, and that these are all residential neighborhoods. I'm going to back up again so you can see the map. AP3 kind of encompasses the Arts District, and it has Crispus Attucks, Pinecrest, and Capitol Court. And so they're all modest single-family homes. And if there's an ability to provide some flex in the guidelines, this might be the place that we could do that. Again, that's the kind of thought pattern that the ARB is moving forward with, but we have not received feedback yet, and we don't want to make any final decisions or come to any conclusions without receiving the feedback from the public and the property owners. That ends my update. I'm happy to answer any questions that the council might have.
Well, thank you for that. It has been a long time since we've had this conversation.
Yes.
It's hard to remember us getting together and having that discussion, but I think it's an important one, and I do appreciate that you all have kept this conversation going. And based on what I hear today, I think we're heading in the right direction, because I think part of this for me and some others on council, and they'll speak for themselves, is how do we introduce some modern materials into these older houses so that it I think ultimately enhances home ownership and makes these houses more livable. So I applaud you and the ARB for having this discussion and getting us to this point. Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you for the presentation, and as the mayor stated, I think we're all looking for that flexibility. One question I did have, you said 50 individuals attended the material showcase. What was the feedback? Was there positive feedback with the varieties of materials that were offered?
Yes, it was really more curiosity of, kind of what these things were. We had a display of new materials. We also had a display of materials that we already had approved. And so they were interested in, what they could do specifically with their property. And so it was a really good opportunity for staff to kind of interact with all of those individuals and, answer questions they had. And they were also asking about the process. Some folks have an idea that they want to move forward with, but they're kind of holding off to see where the guidelines go, and hoping that there are some changes made.
Thank you, and I just look forward to the meeting with the additional recommendations.
Thanks. Look forward to the discussions on AP3. I think there are some mixed messages there now. We go down and say Lafayette, and there are the aluminum awnings which aren't allowed. There are the aluminum storm doors that are allowed. There are aluminum storm windows that are allowed. But as you said, going down, once you've got an aluminum storm window on there, you may not be able to even tell whether it's a divided light window or not. So what are our real priorities? And I think that'll be a good discussion. Thank you.
And I agree with my colleagues in that I think we look forward to joint discussion on and putting everything on the table. I thought it was helpful having the material showcase, particularly for someone who owns a house from 1932, where it's very difficult to get original materials these days. And so I'll be, like Vice Mayor Dent said, was curious as to what the feedback was from the people who came. And do you anticipate having any more outreach for materials between now and the fall when we might have our meeting?
I have contacted a couple of other representatives. There were a few that were not able to attend our showcase for various reasons, but I've informed them that if they would like to come to an ARB meeting, we have in the past hosted representatives that have a new product that just wanted to introduce it to the board. And so I've extended that invitation, and we meet twice a month, so we have a number of meetings that'll take place between now and final adoption, and if they're able to and want to, they'll reach out. It was interesting when we did the showcase, there were still a number of businesses that weren't doing what they consider trade shows, which is kind of what this fell into, and had travel restrictions, and there were a number that were just so short-staffed they weren't able to send somebody for that 4-hour window. So it's an opportunity to be as flexible as possible. I've also asked, if they want to send me materials, at least for the board to kind of put their hands on, we can do that. And I've had a couple of folks that have brought materials by my office that I've been able to share with the board that way.
Good, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Ms. Burke. I remember being at that first meeting in March 7th, shortly after everything changed, but I thought then, and I'm sure the more recent meetings now, are organized very well. There's a good description of the purpose of the design review that we're doing, and also a good participation from people that lived in those districts. I have two quick questions. We'll have our joint meeting around September, I think you said, and then it would come back in front of council in December. Would that mean that new materials would then be allowed effective immediately, or in the new year of 2022? When would that take effect?
Well, it would require a public hearing, so the final adoption has to go before City Council. It'll go for a public hearing at ARB, a public hearing at Planning Commission, and final adoption before this body. And I'll have to defer to Chris on when that becomes effective. It might be 10 days after adoption, but I would suspect that if folks are holding off, we'll receive applications in January, because the ARB only meets once in December. So.
Okay. And second, has there been a comparison, or will there be a comparison presented to council when we meet with the ARB about the actual cost differential of some of the materials compared next to each other, and then maybe a more nebulous cost of what it might take to refurbish a home with some of the newer materials as opposed to the older materials when strictly those were allowed?
There has not been. We have had that conversation kind of in a bigger picture setting about windows primarily, because obviously there's a cost associated with refurbishing and caring for windows. There's a cost associated with the energy efficiency and with the disposal of old windows. There's kind of been this more nebulous conversation about that cost, but that specific, rehab price point has not been discussed. If that's something that council would like, staff can try to work with maybe a local contractor to see if we could come up with numbers. I think it'll vary considerably depending on the condition of the actual home when somebody is working on that.
Well, I recognize it's very much a gray area, but
yes.
that'd be an interesting number to see if there could be a case study, so to speak, of one of the houses in an AP3 and how it might change before and after this guideline review.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. No other questions. We appreciate the presentation and look forward to the hard work of staff and ARB moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. That takes us to item B, presentation of the proposed 2021 Economic Development Plan update, COVID-19 pandemic impact analysis and recovery plan. Ms. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. The city's current, 21-22 goals and initiatives process talks about a COVID recovery plan. And we've been working on this since we entered COVID, and sort of a reactionary response, and then trying to get ahead of it and plan for resiliency and recovery. The EDA looked at its existing economic development plan, which was approved in 2019. And as we always say, we don't want those plans to just sit on the shelf. And COVID-19 certainly seemed like a reason to take it off the shelf and take another look and see how we could include the COVID recovery and resiliency issues to it. So to that end, we started last fall. We surveyed all of our existing businesses. We held 3 public meetings at EDA meetings, and then our consultant worked with stakeholder interviews with EDA members and business leaders and other stakeholders in the community. And then they did all the research and data analysis around are our targeted sectors that we're trying to attract to the city the right ones. Once we identified which the right ones are, which are areas where there's growth potential but also fit in with our economy and our community here, then what is our value proposition? Why would those businesses choose Williamsburg over someone else? So I'm delighted to introduce Penny Whiteheart. You see her on the screen. She's in Elkin, North Carolina right now on Main Street there. And she's joining us. She's part of the team that did that research and the drafting of the plan. And she's going to actually go through the plan and the COVID recovery and resiliency. Penny's been working in economic development for 30 years. She's worked in the private sector and the public sector, both regionally and locally, and we're delighted to have her here today. I'll turn it over to you, Penny.
Thanks very much. Let me see if I can magically share my screen with you all, and then I want to share some slides. Michelle, I really appreciate your reviewing everything we went through to bring us to this day. And I do have some slides. I think they've been shared with you in advance, but I would encourage you to spend some time with the full document. And so we'll just get a little high-level overview through these slides, have some time for discussion, and maybe you've already found time to read through the document. But as Michelle said, we wanted to sort of build on and update the 2019 plan through a recovery and COVID lens, hoping to, make more meaningful and appropriate the strategies and targets from that plan, and also to be more thoughtful about recovery and resiliency in the local and regional economy. She talked about our scope of work. And again, I'm going to go through some of the results of that, but I would encourage you, this last item, the competitive positioning statements, I'd encourage you to review those in the full document, because it really sort of illustrates and tries to articulate Williamsburg's position in each of the economic development strategies that we've outlined. I'm going to go through these in some more detail. You'll see there are 6, and that's a very ambitious group of goals, I would say. And a lot of these are repeated from the work in 2019. But as I mentioned, through the pandemic and the experiences that we've been through, the tremendous outreach that the EDA did during the pandemic, and then as part of this work, and we have incorporated that learning and hopefully, some new approaches, both in terms of the businesses' approaches to their work and economic development approaches to marketing and positioning a community for growth. So the first goal has to do with connecting, strengthening a set of target clusters, and I'll just remind us that those clusters for Williamsburg include tourism and hospitality. And I've really enjoyed hearing from some of the representatives of that sector here this afternoon. Professional and technical services, and then business support services, and of course, health services and healthcare. And each of these clusters will benefit from being connected among themselves to maybe learn from each other and compare resources and and practices, and it'll also help the EDA and your community learn more about those cluster assets when you're communicating outside of your community. We'd also love to see more connectivity with centers of innovation or centers for research at William and Mary or other institutions of a reasonable, in a reasonable diameter from Williamsburg. And this can be really attractive to companies, especially when technology and innovation is imperative for their growth, for their survival. We think there's a lot of opportunity there. We know that some of these clusters, like hospitality and tourism, have some very critical short-term needs. And so we've included that in the implementation plan to focus on those first. And then we are aware that the Greater Williamsburg Partnership is either just completing or about to complete a revision of the regional target industry analysis that will drive their recruitment program. And we want to make sure that the EDA stays tapped into that. We know that these four clusters are included right now, and we'll just make sure that we continue to see how the EDA's efforts connect in and further leverage what the Greater Williamsburg Partnership is doing. We also heard a lot about talent from your speakers from the floor, and I appreciated that. More and more, this is driving success and capacity for businesses. And so really matching up your talent pipeline and the ecosystem that is training that pipeline with the clusters, the targets that you're most interested in supporting for your economy. You can raise awareness of the careers and the career pathways in those clusters. A lot of times kids and students really are not aware of what is available inside of a community in terms of head of household jobs and the ability to sustain a career. And so maybe being more vocal about those occupational clusters, really looking for ways to connect the college students who are here with businesses in Williamsburg through internships or work-based learning programs, or even just awareness so that they have an appreciation of what the career opportunities are locally, so that they may choose to stay, certainly an important part of your pipeline, or the next bullet point that as alumni, they may have an opportunity to come back, and you want to make sure that they have a positive impression of what the regional economy and lifestyle could offer them if in a different phase of their life, they had the opportunity to return to Williamsburg for a job. So that's sort of working in the pipeline, making sure that your numbers and availability are growing. And you also want to look at the talent and training programs. And while y'all have terrific higher education partners, both there in Williamsburg and in the greater region, if you will, I'm looking for more short-term training. This is really where a lot of growth is going, even for postgraduate learners, professional learners who want to pick up a new credential or a new skill. And certainly this is the case in healthcare, another important target. And then finally, this whole new world of remote work and being seen as a location where people can thrive, maybe working remotely and commuting to a location less often, or just doing it intermittently because it can be seen as a flexibility perk for your workforce. And Williamsburg has a lot to offer, both from the lifestyle side and the remote work side. Marketing is certainly, marketing and positioning Williamsburg is certainly a central feature of economic development programming. And so the strategies here look at taking where we are in terms of so much more importance on digital and e-communications for marketing and recruitment, virtual recruitment strategies like virtual consultant events, or maybe even virtual meetings with prospects now. And the EDA has a lot of opportunity to shine with these positioning statements and more robust lead generation. And we'll just continue to say that it's so important to stay, locked at the hip, like I know Michelle is, with both the Greater Williamsburg Partnership and the state's economic development activities, so that you make sure that Williamsburg is always thought of and included in those economic development, marketing, and recruitment missions, and where appropriate, you participate as well. I don't want to leave out targeting inside your existing businesses, because we know that job creation does happen, the majority of it does happen with existing businesses. And so as you select companies for a visitation program, or even just for programs that the city might have, that you continue to think about these target clusters as the ones that are really driving the economy, and the ones you're really looking to for economic growth. We'll look for ways to measure the results. These can be metrics or they can be milestones. And generally on an annual basis, you can put together a work plan that'll reflect these strategies. In a few slides, we'll look at an implementation scheme, but we will make sure to measure the results in order to reinvest in those that are returning results, and then to pivot away in the cases where our tactics are not taking us toward the results that we had expected. This strategy really is talking about the product and the physical locations that you have to support growth in these target sectors. And we are recommending looking both at city-owned properties or sites, and developing relationships or awareness among private partners with what the growth targets and cluster priorities are of the city, in order to really tease out those promising sites or even office space that could be available for growth in the target sectors. Of course, we know that small businesses and startups are really the engines of an economic development system, and continuing to be open and aware of the needs of startups and growing businesses, having promotions and ease of access for folks who are in the business startup phase, and some tactics to target specific groups like women, minorities, and the youth who have a propensity for startups and success in small business growth. And then, of course, the pandemic has taught us a lot about the digital strategies and e-commerce and touchless systems. And so continuing to really be forward-looking in how we're supporting and growing businesses, and that their resiliency and opportunity to pivot or to overcome challenges in the future is part of the way we talk to them and prepare them for growth. Talking now about incentive policies, we'll look to really matching up the way that incentive policies exist and what we know about the clusters in these targeted sectors. And also just an encouragement to have flexibility and maybe look for some alternative ways of accomplishing your goals during the recession and this recovery period. Again, hearing from your existing businesses during the first part of this meeting was very valuable, just in thinking about on the ground how tourism is coming back, but how still some companies feel very fragile as they're moving into this next part, hopefully this summer of doing a lot of new things. On this slide, we tried very ambitiously to lay out all of these strategies in sort of a 3-year map. And you'll see that year 1 is very heavily weighted. Of course, we want to get started and get everything underway. And we'll encourage you, like I said, to put together annual plans to reflect metrics and goals that are important and meaningful at that time. And that'll cause you to sort of flex year 2 and 3 as new opportunities or new partners come along. You may be able to start something sooner than you think, or you may choose to postpone something even though you had intended to begin it. And of course, there's so much that's ongoing that can't be delayed. And we've captured this in the bottom. A lot of it is the background, marketing and communications, the data that is needed to support that activity. We really can't overstate the importance of partnerships and leverage and seeing how your goals and strategies align with others, and just being real intentional about working to leverage every activity that you can of your allies or your stakeholders. And I've given a lot of information in what felt like a short period of time, but this is the time for feedback and discussion. And I'll ask Michelle if there's anything particular she wants to add at this point.
Maybe she has something she wants to add.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you for the presentation, and I know you're here to answer specific questions from council. I'll say one thing. Councilwoman Ramsey and I could say that the EDA has emphasized is where we can partner with people who are experts in these areas, for example, workforce. So your economic development office is not going to become the workforce specialist for the region or the city, but we know who those people are, and we know how to work with them and bring those resources to the city. Working in another example with our Human Services Department on the One-Stop Center to get that reopened here, to get those assets back in Greater Williamsburg. So wherever we can, we look at not duplicating, but working with our partners and allies. The Greater Williamsburg Partnership is another example, as well as the Launchpad Incubator at William & Mary.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Penny, for being with us here virtually today. When I listened to the presentation, and I haven't gone through all the cards specifically, but then I certainly will before Thursday when we're going to be asked to make a decision on this. But I see this work as valuable because it really is economic development. It's vibrancy to Williamsburg. It's helping to be a part of what we want Williamsburg to be, where people can, the brain drain maybe slows down a little bit from the college. Young entrepreneurs and folks from high schools can, have job opportunities that they may not otherwise. And so by creating these jobs, ultimately it comes back to helping the municipality in so many ways, but not the least of which is tax revenue. And so this work is valuable. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vice Mayor.
Yeah, thank you for the update. It's obviously, as the mayor pointed out, it's a comprehensive update. So trying to read through all the material and comprehend all the material. Obviously, I'll get that done before Thursday. But there's so many action steps in there. We want to make sure that we have an understanding of all of them. Two of the ones we talked about specifically was the ABC permit for downtown that allows to go alcoholic beverages, and also the long-term plan for outdoor dining. I think I spoke early on when we allowed the outdoor dining that I would be an advocate for that continuing, but obviously to see what that plan would look like, and to see where the funding comes from and who's going to be responsible for that funding, since we're talking about budget as well. So again, there's a lot of action steps in there. It's all great work, and it will bring that, hopefully bring that vibrancy back to Williamsburg.
Thanks. Yeah, Michelle, you spoke to my first comment, which was going to be with a department of 3.5 people?
3.
Oh, you're down to 3 now.
Oh, yeah.
Well, okay, 3 people. You really can't do all that. And even with the help from all your EDA members, including Barbara, it's really important to build on the synergies with all the partners we have, so that you're not reinventing the wheel, and you can sort of work together and sort of jump off where they've actually brought potential clients to a point, and then how can they benefit from being within the city. I think as organizations pivot post-COVID, I think we could look at Williamsburg as a work hub center, where we could actually provide facilities, touchdown facilities, educational opportunities, hybrid conferences with, speakers can be virtual, but they're also can be in person, especially the trade show component of conferences, and then all within, a family-oriented community, which we've got so many opportunities in Williamsburg area for the whole family to be here. And I think maybe focusing on that as one part of the initiative might give us, something that sort of jump start, our economic development post-COVID.
Yes, and we just had a meeting, Councilmember Maslin with Vicki Semino of the Williamsburg Tourism Council about how, to your point, the messaging of what makes this a great tourism location, family-oriented, high quality of life, also is part of the economic development messaging. And as Penny mentioned, if people can work from home now, so maybe they're based out of Boston, but they can live in Williamsburg. We're working with a prospect right now who's out of DC and has purchased a home here and is wondering whether to move his headquarters to this area, and his staff being able to be virtual is a big part of that.
And I've led probably half a dozen site selection projects, and especially corporate headquarters. You sort of look, where are the affinities that the chief executive officer has? And the more people we've got who have affinities to Williamsburg, the College of William and Mary, the more successful we can be. Thanks.
I don't have too much to add. I will just piggyback on what Councilman Maslin said about looking at different opportunities. To me, it's like expanding the brand of Williamsburg. We've often talked about that in tourism, but this can sort of go hand in hand. And so I think it's really important to look sort of outside the box of just our standard tourism. And we did look at a number of, action steps. There are a lot of them there, and as Ted said, there are only 3 of you, and EDA is a little limited too. So I hope that that those action steps could be broken down into really the ones with the most likelihood of success, both on their time to execute and also their time to see some impact. Because I think that would be quite helpful. And a couple of the things we've talked about at the EDA, I'm sure we'll continue to discuss. So thanks to both of you for the presentation.
Thank you very much. I will echo my council colleagues, Director DeWitt and Ms. Whitehart, for your presentation today. I've got a couple of comments and then 2 quick questions. I'll first say, Ms. Whitehart, it's admirable that you're able to give a presentation while also watching yourself give that presentation on the big screen. So thank you for doing so and having that grace under pressure. 2 places that I'd like to maybe see some of our plan address as we look at areas of the city that could be invested in. One of which I remember from the internship that I had with the Economic Development Department, and it's brought up in the study, is the need for smaller office spaces for smaller companies or for companies that are just beginning and people need a couple of rooms but nothing too large. And there were some opportunities at Strawberry Plains. And so I would love to see that soon enough, 100% leased up from people who are just beginning their businesses or interested in living in Williamsburg and working here and trying to find those smaller office spaces. And the second, which would take a lot of coordination with Riverside, is the field across from Riverside Hospital, which I think initially was meant for a mixed-use development or commercial development, more retail and restaurant, but so far has gone mostly vacant. And that might be a really interesting area with intersections right there to see what can be put. Finally, remote work, it's mentioned to find people who could be featured. I don't mean to say this is a self-plug, but as a remote worker here, I truly love it. I mean, I'm able to bike from my house to the hub, the downtown area of Williamsburg in 3-4 minutes. And so I very much agree with trying to see the city from a pro work from home standpoint, doing that myself. One question, how could we include JCC and York County in these discussions, sort of similar to the regional collaborative that we bought into months ago to provide a facility for drone testing and usage, similarly minded, finding larger areas of development that might be in the counties but would be to the benefit of greater Williamsburg?
Sure. I think there's at least two answers to that question. One would be we're already doing it through the Greater Williamsburg Partnership in terms of working together about what our assets are and leveraging our resources to market and target businesses to come. So that's already happening. And as Penny mentioned, our targeted industries align with the Greater Williamsburg Partnership. So we're able to use their lead generation investment instead of doing our own. But the second point would be about that sort of land-based development. I think that's really exciting. I think that the joint project under the EV-RIFA, the Regional Industrial Facilities Authority, that's located in York County is a prime example of how we can move forward in that way. And it doesn't, economic development for Williamsburg is broader than just unmanned systems or technology companies. It's also tourism investment. And I think that the three localities have very robust conversations about that. So the mechanisms are in place, and as that project, we hope will close in July. And when that happens, I think it's time to start looking at the other opportunities to do that in Greater Williamsburg.
Well, thank you both again for the presentation.
Okay, so we have our work cut out for us for Thursday's meeting. Got to go through this. I guess if we can approve it as it is or make any adjustments to it at the
Yes,
meeting.
I neglected to mention next steps. So your Economic Development Authority, as I said, spent several meetings on this plan. This is the version they're recommending that City Council adopt as an update to our Economic Development Plan. So that is the request Thursday, that you adopt the plan to move forward.
Okay, I think we'll be ready for that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so that takes us now to agenda item C under background presentations, the presentation and discussion concerning the update to the FY22 budget. Mr. Trivett.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll wait on Mark to get us set up here. All right. So we wanted to start today's conversation with this chart, which is just sort of showing you the tax histories for some of our surrounding localities. The question was asked at the last meeting why we need to raise our tax when other localities have not done that. And so we wanted to just give you a little bit of history on that issue. As you can see, many localities did raise their taxes, and in most cases, to deal with this very issue, a structural imbalance in their capital planning. Years ago, and the city of Williamsburg did not do that. And so you can look at it as we're behind or our need came later, but either way, that's the issue that we're facing. In addition, this sort of illustrates that there are a lot of other fees and things that are charged by the other localities that we don't levy. So we've talked a lot today already about the American Rescue Plan, and this is obviously the elephant in the room. And so we wanted to just give you a little bit of feedback, as this is still a very much evolving issue. How can you use the money? How much money are you going to get? When are you going to get it? So we just pulled some quotes down to illustrate the point here. If you read the 150 pages worth of restrictions, guidelines from the Treasury Department on how to use this money, it's clear that their intent is to inspire transformational change in communities that receive the funding. They've gone to great lengths to try and discourage using it to fill budget gaps. And so it's a little bit confusing in the early indications we got from the federal government of that was exactly why they were doing this. And then it turns out that they made it somewhat difficult to do that. So here's just a simple list of the restrictions. Again, I said 150 pages, slightly less if you look at it in the Federal Register because they separate it into 3 columns of font of about 8. So it is difficult to navigate that. And the wording on these restrictions are very different than what we saw with the CARES Act. The CARES Act was pretty definitive. You can do this, you can't do that. And with this, it's much more nebulous in the sense that it will frequently say there's broad latitude provided to the locality and then give you a list of things that you can't do, but then say that list is not meant to exclude certain uses. And so it's hard to understand, which is why we're seeing a lot of questions go to Treasury and answers or interim guidance being released that clarify what they intended by what they wrote. So that's still a work in progress. So one of the things that is obviously a key concern, and particularly as we talk about raising taxes, is can we use the money to replace lost revenue? And if you read the restrictions, it's clear that that's an intention of use, right? I sort of take issue with the fact that they call it revenue replacement because there's so many restrictions applied to it. It almost punishes localities that did what we did, which is navigate the pandemic by relying on our reserves, because it exclusively does not allow the direct repayment of those monies to reserve funds or to stabilization lines in your budget. So it's sort of misleading. What they did is they provided a formula to calculate how much localities could use of the money you're going to receive for revenue replacement. And we have run that formula. It continues to evolve, as I said, as Treasury issues more and more guidance on what they meant and how the formula should apply. Our original estimate was $10 million. I think we're down to 9.5, 9.6.
Our approximately 10 million had us at 9.6, and our last pass was about 9.2, and that's if we have to exclude not just utility enterprise revenues, but any tax revenue or revenue from public utilities at all.
So what's happening is, as localities run this formula, they're asking the question of the Treasury, what revenues can be included and what have to be excluded, and then Treasury issues more guidance, and that refines how we run the formula. So that's where we are at today. Of the money that we might receive, approximately $10 million, as Barbara said, depending upon answers to questions that were levied, 9.2 maybe, but still in the ballpark of that number. So then we wanted to give you some more information on, the intention of this money and how it impacts us financially. So we've given you this rather long quote from Moody's Investor Service, and this is taken from their most recent review of the city's finances, which was just a few weeks ago. In fact, I believe the report isn't even public yet. And we just thought that this really highlighted the strength of the city over time to deal with shortfalls, and that strength has been our commitment to having a strong reserve. And then the next quote is from Davenport and Company, talking about their advice to their clients, Davenport representing many of the local governments across the state, and of course being our financial advisor. So what we wanted to do is ask Mr. Sanders to come speak to you today about Davenport's guidance on the use of ARP.
Good afternoon. Good to see everybody again. Jimmy Sanderson with Davenport and Company. What Mr. Trivett brought up is accurate. I think one of the things we're seeing a lot of our localities looking at are how to use these monies. Some are in different positions. You're in a position where you did have some revenue loss. Frankly, we've seen some jurisdictions that aren't in that position at all and had revenue surplus from where they were historically. So it's varying quite a bit across the Commonwealth of Virginia. One of the things that we're seeing, and by just the definition or the term that Treasury is using, an interim final rule, should lead a little bit into the uncertainty that you're seeing. And so we're advising our clients to sort of take a step back, don't make any rush judgments about how you use that money. Hopefully, you will be able to find ways that you can use it that will be revenue generators for you going forward, as opposed to just using those monies and them being sort of one-off. One of the things that we had a conversation about, interestingly, was the historical use of tobacco funds in Virginia. Virginia did a very good job of setting up a tobacco commission that used some of the settlement monies from the tobacco industry, and are still using those monies today to provide economic development for local governments. Some states didn't do that, and they use those monies just as one-time expenses, and they're no longer available to help those jurisdictions. So that's just some of the cautions that we're providing our local governments. Again, caution maybe too strong a word, but maybe some guidance that others are looking at as well, is to try to find a way that is going to be able to use those monies, leverage them, hopefully in ways that may bring back those revenues plus to the city going forward. So we're expecting those rules hopefully to get some additional guidance back to you from Treasury that will allow some of these questions that Barbara and Andrew are looking at to be a little bit more guidance that they can give you. One of the other things that just to mention from Moody's there, Williamsburg has got a great credit rating. You're AAA rated by S&P, you're AA1 rated by Moody's. That is based a lot off of how you have operated historically. You've had balanced structural budgets going forward, and you've got good reserves. A combination of those things are really what puts you at where you are. The only really thing that would be there that could harm that would be sort of a trend of budgets that are not structurally balanced, and in particular when those would lead to a depletion of your reserves. A one-time thing is not going to hurt your credit ratings, but the rating agencies specifically would look at a trend over time. So that's the only thing that I would caution you as a governing body is just to understand that it's the trends that you're going to be setting that the rating agencies would look at, and your budget today again isn't one that's going to move the needle one way or the other, but it is at least a starting point for the way the rating agencies would look at you going forward.
Thank you.
If I just follow up, so in your experience, or whether you or Ms. Dam can answer the question, when we talk about interim guidance, when do you think we'll get interim final guidance, is I think what you called it? When is the final coming?
Yeah. I mean, hopefully the expectation will be the Treasury's going to get some feedback from local governments for these exact questions that you're asking, and which is, help us understand how we can use these funds, and they will come back with final guidance. I mean, I think that's expected within 90 days from when that original interim final rules were put out. So that's the goal. Treasury, I mean, you saw with the CARES Act, they came out with rules and they flipped a switch on a lot of local governments at the very end of the day. So the term unprecedented has been used a lot lately, but we're in a little bit of that environment. They understand the position they've put us in a little bit. The hope will be that they'll be able to come out with a little bit more firm guidance going forward. And again, that was expected within 90 days of when that original rule was put out.
Thank you.
All right, so the other thing that we wanted to do today was just we've talked a lot about recovering from the pandemic, and so Barbara and I spent some time working on what that might look like for us. And so on the left-hand side of this slide, you've got recovering from our losses. These are the losses that we expect to have over the term, so a total of $6.8 million. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a little bit about what does revenue recovery look like, because that's a very different question. And we've talked a tremendous amount about how does the FY22 budget expectation for revenues compare to the FY19 actual performance, so pre-pandemic compared to post-pandemic. And that's a valid question for analyzing what we think our budget performance might be, but a better question when considering what recovery looks like is what would those revenues have been without the pandemic at all. And so we just wanted to show you those numbers, and that's what's on the right-hand side, the FY22 revenue collection column. Those are what the revenues would have been forecasted to be in FY22 if we had not had the pandemic. So we were asked to put together some options on how we could use this money that we're expected to receive, and we put these together to show you. Number one is the very strong temptation of using this money to fill the budget gap that we've identified. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the intention of the funding that's been provided to invest in long-term health, projects that are going to generate return in the future for the community. And so we've just sort of gone through different ways that you could do that. The difficulty in putting a slide like this together at this point is the fact that so much of the rules are still not 100% certain. And there's a lot of ambiguity in what's been said in the guidance that's been published. So I think the best course of action is to not focus in on how are we going to apply the bulk of the ARP money. Let's hold that in abeyance until we know for sure what's allowed. Let's look at what some other localities are doing with the funds, and then make sure that whatever decision we put on the table to use this sort of, I'm going to use the word unprecedented, amount of money provided by the federal government in the best fashion for Williamsburg's long-term health. And it may be that the best use is to fill budget gaps, but I think it's just too rushed for us to have that conversation fully so quickly. So here, we just wanted to show you the application of ARP funding in the two budget scenarios that we've been talking about, a 64-cent tax rate increase at the top and a 66-cent rate at the bottom. And so the assumption that's made here in these two scenarios is that we use the ARP funding to provide money for the police station, the library, and some school projects in the CIP. Now, the effect of that is it reduces the amount to which the CIP needs to lean on additional funding provided by the general fund. So that's the best way to assist the general fund and the CIP at the same time with this funding. So the outcome of that is, on the general fund side, you can see in that bottom line set of numbers, you're relying more on the deficit, which would mean the amount of money we're taking from the reserve to balance the fiscal year budget in 22 under the 64-cent proposal, and less under the 66-cent proposal. I mean, that's just common sense. But the longer term effect is what I think is really should be noted, and that is in 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27, the remaining balances, the surplus or deficit of $159,000, $306,000, $250,000, $193,000, and $136,000 compared to our overall budget of $60 million is a very thin margin of error. And so if the revenues don't perform for one reason or another, a small hiccup in sales tax, meals tax, room taxes, we're not going to make the estimates. And that's a very stark contrast to how we have budgeted in the city of Williamsburg for many, many years. Always having, at the end of the year, a surplus that equaled anywhere from $1.6 to $2.3 million. And then we relied on that surplus to heal any wounds to the reserve, to heal the CIP in terms of its overreaching demands. And so I want to point out that that's a significant shift in our overall budget strategy.
And so this speaks to the issue at hand, because the proposed tax increase does not satisfy this year's budget. I mean,
right.
We're not contemplating a tax increase so that we can balance the budget this year.
That's right.
Proposed tax increase would be used to support this, to create this budget surplus, which we then in turn, as you said, shore up our reserve funds and support our capital improvement plan.
Right.
Without that tax increase, the numbers would be red all the way through 23, 4, 5, and 6.
Right.
And which would mean we would have to dig into our reserves more, which would run afoul to our reserve fund policy of 35%. Okay.
That's right. Exactly. I mean, one way to look at it is our reserve is essentially the city's savings account, right? And in times of need in your own personal finances, you go to the savings account to get through, bridge the gap. And then hopefully you enact a plan to repay that savings. And during that repayment, times are hard because you're having to make that payment to rebuild before you can start moving forward again. And so for us, we're trying to minimize that period of recovery so that forward momentum can begin as soon as possible. So then the bottom note just highlights how long it takes us to do that recovery under each one of these scenarios. So what do we expect? Again, we are absolutely expecting that we're going to get $15.5 million as a part of the ARP. There's some questions still hanging out there about an additional $2.9 million that we might get directly from Treasury. But again, no guidance has been provided as to whether or not we're eligible for that. It may be that we just have to ask for it and be denied. So we're thinking about how to access that funding if it's really available. The $15.5 million was passed down from Treasury to the state of Virginia, and the state has to decide how to disperse it. We're still waiting on confirmation from the Department of Finance in Richmond on how that's going to happen. We were in contact with them last week. They told us that the Secretary would be issuing a letter to all localities in this situation, and we've not gotten that letter yet.
Is it fair to assume that when the money comes from the State Finance Department, that there may be additional guidelines put on how
There's
these funds?
clearly not supposed to be. The guidance makes it very clear that the states are not allowed to attach additional restrictions on how the money can be used. But the guidance that was published terms the process of deciding how much money to distribute as recommendation to the states, which implies that they have latitude in changing that. We've not seen anything from the state of Virginia to imply that they intend to do that. I would be very surprised if they did. So then at the bottom is, what we expect in terms of the ARP application. That's the numbers that we just showed you and how the 66 cents applies. And then our recommendation. And yes, it's true. Our recommendation is to stay the course and adopt the 66-cent budget. What we want you to see here is this slide shows you numbers that are very different than the other slides, and that's because it does not include the ARP application. As I said, and as Davenport has said, the best guidance we can give you is adopt the budget without that, and then when we get the funding and the dust settles a little bit on how it can be used, let's amend the budget. And I think that guidance and recommendation from your staff applies to whichever budget you decide to adopt, whether it's 66 or 64 or some other variant of the tax rate. We should not adopt a budget that includes that money yet. It may be our full intention to use some amount of that to balance the budget and avoid the tax increase, but again, it's too early to commit ourselves to that strategy. And that's what we say here. We come back and adjust the budget within 6 months. We should have all of that answered and have a clear path as to what the best plan is for using this funding. And then the third recommendation is to adopt the recommended financial policy updates. The one caveat to number 3 is that one of those financial policies that we wrote establishes a process of repaying the reserve after it's been accessed below the 35%. And under Davenport's guidance, we made the time window what they said would be acceptable to the rating agencies. And depending upon which of the tax scenarios you decide to adopt, that's possible or impossible. So it may be that when we get to Thursday's meeting and the item comes up to consider these financial policies, we would ask you to not act on that one, depending upon whether or not we can or cannot satisfy that requirement. We don't want to set ourselves up for being in violation of a financial policy right out of the gate. And with that, we're ready to take questions.
If I may, I'll start with a couple questions. One of the suggestions I've made, and I see it's kind of briefly talked about this in the use of ARP funds. I had put forward a suggestion that, or the question of whether or not we could use ARP funds to help taxpayers that have been adversely affected via COVID, say the revenues decline, personal or business-wise, that any increase in the tax could be granted back to the taxpayer. Is that?
Yeah, so I failed to mention that, but we did have that on one of the slides. The mayor had brought up the idea of offering a grant program to help with those families who have been most impacted, businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19, using some component of the ARP funding. And so, yes, absolutely, it's clear we can provide grants to offset losses like that. And definitely there is a process by which we could grant back the amount of the tax increase to those folks that qualify.
And I thought that was a great idea, of course.
It was a great idea.
Well, but, I think for a lot of folks who've been saying this is not the time to do it because of the economic impact that it's had on businesses and people, here's an opportunity that's built into what we can do to help offset that.
Right.
And so if your income has declined, and we don't know what that number is, but a decision could be made, say 20%, whether it's business or personal, then you can come in and apply for that grant to offset the increase.
Yeah.
So then you would have no negative impact.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, listening to the comments and certainly seeing the news about how much money each locality is going to get, I completely understand. It's very hard to understand why we would need a tax increase while at the same time receiving such large quantity of funding from the federal government. And we've done our best to make the case for why the tax increase is still needed. So the only other thought that I can offer on that question is that using the ARP funding to postpone the tax increase will not resolve the structural deficiency. Revenues would have to grow exponentially in order for that to resolve itself over time. And so the one thing that I would say as a cautionary note, I think, and I'm pretty sure Ms. Dameron agrees, the longer we delay enacting a tax increase of some kind, the likelihood is that when we do act to raise taxes, we'll have to raise them higher than what we have proposed. Because it's likely that that deficit just gets larger and larger, artificially stemmed by this money from the federal government. And I think the example of the Virginia Tobacco Commission and how Virginia used its tobacco allocation is a great example. Many states used it to fill budget holes, billions of dollars, and they have nothing to show for that expense other than artificially low taxes for a few years that then had to be raised once the money ran out. In Virginia, we're still using that money to spur economic development in areas that need it. And I think that that's exactly the opportunity that we have. And so we want to take our time, be slow, and make sure that whatever decision we make regarding the use of that funding is the best use for the city of Williamsburg.
So if we did not impose any tax increase and we ran the deficit in our capital improvement plan, we would have to go back to our reserves to support it, or decide not, we would just have to keep pushing items back. And some of that is building maintenance, vehicle replacements. And so essentially what we would be doing is deferring today's cost till tomorrow, and tomorrow things may be more expensive. And so to your point about not raising taxes today may mean the tax increase that's coming. I mean, make no bones about it, there's going to have to be one unless somehow the economy turns around and gets back to 1988. And I don't know that that's going to happen here in town. Things are going to get more expensive, and then I think for me the quality of life starts to diminish as we get into that hole. So
yeah, I think the question of, when you're thinking about no tax increase, yes, we would have to make a decision one way or the other. Are we going to reduce expenses to represent that loss of revenue from the budget we have presented? Are we going to make up that difference using additional money from the reserve, with the thought being that when the ARP does arrive, we're going to reverse that and supplant that with ARP funding? Those are sort of the two strategies that would have to be decided upon in order to enact a budget that did not include any tax increase.
Well, so in terms of the ARP, I think it would be foolish of us to make short-term decisions with the ARP money today, given the interim final guidance has not come in. And I think as Mr. Sanders said, it would be much wiser for us to get that money and understand how we can use it, and then look to invest that money in ways that will eventually slow down the need for additional tax increases, and whatever that may mean. And we'll figure that out. So if we develop a supplemental budget with those funds, I think is the best way to move forward. So I may have some more questions or comments, but I'll turn it over to Vice Mayor Dent.
Yeah. So I just want to start out, but first of all, for everyone that continues to contact us and spoke today, we certainly hear you. I certainly hear your message, and I say that at every meeting, but I say it sincerely because you are a part of this process, and it's important how the community feels. I think that's how we benefited from delaying the vote from May until June, is that we've had an opportunity to maybe get an idea of ARP funding and how we can spend it, but also some additional revenue numbers that have come in. So I think it was truly beneficial in delaying the vote until June. I said from the beginning, when I saw the 8-cent proposed tax increase from the city manager, I was an advocate from the beginning for a 4-cent, maybe that would lessen the burden. And that wasn't to question Mr. Trivett's numbers or Ms. Dameron's numbers on the budget. It's the message that we've heard in emails, and what we've heard today is now's just not the time to impose an additional 8-cent tax increase on the community. So I've been an advocate for the 4. Mr. Trivets laid out the numbers, he reduced it to a 6 with some additional revenues, what it looks like with a 4. You know, all this week I've talked about when we started hearing about ARP funds coming in, what would it look like if we took those ARP funds and basically a small portion of them and bought down this tax increase to get us through this 1 year. And I realize that doesn't fix our problem for the 5-year period, and Mr. Sanderson's talked about it, Mr. Trivets talked about it. It doesn't fix our problem for the long term, but it does buy us some time to get through this year and allow some recovery. I don't know, I'm not the financial expert that Ms. Dameron is, or Mr. Sanderson, or Mr. Trivet, but I do feel the passion in the community for people that have been impacted by it. Unfortunately, not all of us have had to suffer impacts from it, but there's a lot out there that have. So I know we've talked about what a zero increase would look like, and the mayor just asked a question. That was one of the questions I had written down, what that looks like if we buy that zero, if we don't have a tax increase and we use ARP funds to make up that gap to get us through 1 year. Yeah, potentially we're looking at another, Mr. Trivet's coming back next year with a proposed budget that has a tax increase. Is that something that's going to be more acceptable to the community next year? Who knows? I guess it's all in how everything performs as we come out of the pandemic. So again, I know it doesn't fix our future budgets. So having the option of a 6 and a 4, and we know now what it may take for, if we had no tax increase, to use a small portion of that ARP to correct that. I have to give it more thought myself, because again, I have been an advocate for a 4-cent tax increase from the beginning to lessen the impact on the community, get us somewhat where we need to be, realizing that doesn't fix our future problems, and then we would have to revisit it. So I may have some additional questions as I let the other council colleagues speak.
Maslin?
Thank you. Some good news here. If we support the city manager's operating budget request and recommended capital projects, we now have options on how to balance the revenue side this year. Most of the current dialogue is focused on to what degree an increased real estate tax rate is needed. City staff proposed increasing the rate from 60 cents per $100 of assessed value to 66 cents. This would be in addition to increases seen by each real estate owner whose assessment values may increase again. One resident has calculated that his real estate taxes have increased 34% within the last 5 years. We know that every 1 cent increase in the tax rate generates approximately $200,000 in revenue. Therefore, for every $1.2 million identified in savings and alternate revenue sources, the city can delay any real estate rate increase for a year. By postponing the budget vote until this week, City Council benefits from new information. That includes Williamsburg's Commissioner of Revenue recently predicted increased revenue per year of $263,000. And we know that federal rules allow American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or ARP funds, to replace Williamsburg's reduced revenue during the pandemic. We heard today staff estimates that calculation to be approximately $9.2 million. So what can cities spend this money on after it has been counted as lost revenue? So there's information out there by the National League of Cities, in addition to capital projects that come with maybe some restrictions that the city managers talked about. Other areas listed include healthcare services, school or education services, police, fire, or public safety. So this up to $9.2 million can actually be plugged into the general fund, which helps us balancing the budget. The ARP rules are a game changer, since the most severe financial impact to local government, especially Williamsburg, during the pandemic has been reduced revenue. The CARES Act reimbursed many incremental expenses. Using federal ARP rules, the Virginia Municipal League calculates the city of Williamsburg will be eligible for about $15.5 million in ARP funds, as which we've heard here. They've also indicated that ARP funds have already been transferred to the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that with a successful application, the city could receive up to half of those funds this month, with the remainder next year. Considering this new information, is it wise to increase real estate tax rates as we emerge from a pandemic-induced economic struggle? With the increased revenue projections from the Commissioner of Revenue and less than $1 million from the $15.5 million ARP funds, the city can balance the FY22 budget without raising real estate tax rates this year. Thank you.
So thank you. I have a number of questions and comments, so I'll try and put them all together. Thank you, Mr. Sanderson, for being here from Davenport. I think it's always helpful to have professionals and those with expertise to provide their opinions and guidance, because surely we are not professionals. We rely on the professionals on the staff, and we are not. We are not budget professionals. So it's helpful having your expertise. It's like I wouldn't go to my personal financial advisor to get assistance on the budget, sort of like going to a GP if you have heart issues. But so I appreciate your being here. A couple of things, I'm going to jump back and forth. So a couple comments and questions were brought up about borrowing and how much we can borrow and why don't we do more of that, because we've got low interest rates right now and we know that we have significant projects coming forward. We're taking care of the fire station, we've got the police station, we've got the library, which our share of that, as I understand it, will be based on sort of the usage of city residents compared to county residents, and there's a formula for calculating what our financial obligation will be for the new library, which residents, county and citywide, have decided that they want right there. They want to stay in downtown Williamsburg. But even if you borrow that money, you still have to pay it back. And it looks like the ARP cannot be used for debt service. So even if we borrow that money, when the money's cheap, we can't use ARP money to pay it back. And there's also a ceiling, I think, on how much we can borrow. I mean, we couldn't go out and say, okay, let's do the police station, the library, the Blayton building, all of these in 1 year. That true?
I think there is a limit on how much we can borrow, but it's a very high limit. I think the major concern, and this perhaps answers at least one of the questions, is why don't we borrow more for the projects that are listed? Particularly, why don't we borrow for the school projects? I don't disagree. Those are long-term projects. They're ideal candidates for borrowing. The concern is that our debt profile is low. And for a city our size, revenue constrained, to just jump our debt from this number 3 or 4 times in such short order over 5 or 6 years would definitely raise a red flag with the rating agencies and probably put that rating in concern, which would impact how cheaply we can borrow the money. And so that's why our strategy has been, let's borrow for the municipal projects and pay go the school projects.
And I think a couple things there where you talk about the size of Williamsburg and the size of our budget sort of translate to the reserve policy that we have. I mean, when you say 35%, that seems really high, but I guess I look at this chart and look at, in 2019, we did a tax increase of 3 cents, which generated $558,530. Portsmouth did a 3-cent tax increase, which generated $2.4 million. So just based on our population and size of the budget, sort of impacts the need for a higher percentage of reserve. Is that correct, Ms. Dameron?
That's correct, and I think you have to look at the size of the operating budgets in other localities. 10% maybe,
of $1 billion budget.
Right. where 10% for Williamsburg would be $4 million, which sounds and is a lot of money, but it takes one catastrophe to have to work through and rely on some of that. And then too, I think the tourism-based economy, because typically in hard times, that's the first that gets hurt.
Yeah, we're really pretty fragile because regardless of what we say, our business is tourism. So we've heard a lot too about the restaurants and the struggles that they're having, particularly with staff. And Michelle, I know at our last meeting we talked about a new federal program that was going to be coming through to specifically help restaurants. Can you give us an update, or is there any more information on that?
The restaurant restructuring grant, we've inquired from the Congresswoman's office, and I don't have the update, but I can get that to all of you.
But there was a certain time period when the restaurants had to file for that grant, and that time has passed, I believe.
Yes, and all the restaurants we've talked to did go through the process of applying.
So we don't know at this point how much each restaurant will get or anything like that?
Correct.
Because we're still waiting on the rules.
Correct.
And with staffing issues, has there been any calls from the restaurants to your office for suggestions on where to find people, perhaps training people, outreach to high schools or anything like that?
Not directly. We are aware of the high schools doing that, of our bigger employers doing that, and our regional workforce efforts. But we've really relied on the Business Council, the Greater Williamsburg Business Council, our Chamber of Commerce, to take the lead in that in a regional effort. I'll say we are certainly aware that our businesses in the city itself are struggling with finding workforce right now. But I'd say it's one of a handful of issues we hear from our businesses about.
And a couple things on, it was mentioned about parking revenue. And am I correct in that we adjusted the budget to include parking revenue from the first one? And it's $400 and some thousand dollars that we added in. And as far as revenue projections, it was mentioned that the Commissioner of Revenue provided additional projections, and I think that totaled $263,000. Does that keep us from drawing from the reserve?
No, it takes us from what was about 2.3 million to around 2.1.
So even with those loftier projections, we're still in the red, basically.
Correct.
Okay.
The budgets that we showed you include those adjustments.
Right. And I think it needs to be recognized that the Commissioner of Revenue's position is to collect taxes. They do not come up with the policies for the taxes, and
They assess, and so they collect the receipts for BPOL, not the receipts, but the reports, as well as assess personal property. And then finance collects the money.
But if the budget isn't balanced at the end of a year, I would say the buck stops with you and Mr. Trivett, not the Commissioner of Revenue. It's you all that have the accountability on that. And speaking of the budget, it's my understanding we have to pass a budget this month.
Yes.
And from a conversation we had this morning, we may not get the first group of the funds until August.
That's what we were
Of
told
the
this
ARP.
morning.
Right. And even when that ARP money comes down, it will be in two segments.
Right, 2 tranches.
Why do they call it a tranche? What's a tranche?
2 segments. You're right, 2 segments.
Yeah. So half this year and half 12 months from now.
That's right.
So when we talk about, the 15 whatever million, we're really looking at for this year $8 million at the most. And also something else I was reading said that for the calculation on tax revenue loss, you can't just do it once, that you really have to do it over multiple years. And in fact, something I read said that one reason for doing that, it said it's going to make planning this money somewhat challenging because we're not going to know exactly how much revenue replacement we can bring to bear until later in the process. And this was from Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation said, I think that was an intentional, probably to make sure that states are a little deliberate in how they're using this money. That the goal, is that me? No. Lost my train of thought. And so there is sort of, to reiterate what you all were saying as far as deliberate intentions for the ARP money. And so one other thing that we just saw in the economic development post-COVID thing was recovery and resiliency strategies for small businesses. Now, could ARP be used, some of the funds be used for that program to help the businesses that are most in need, such as our restaurants?
Right, providing additional grants is clearly allowed.
Such as what Mayor Pons was saying for individuals, those who have really been impacted by the pandemic. Because again, another one article was saying, post-pandemic economic growth may yield new revenue as long as states, i.e. communities, don't squander it on tax cuts for individuals or companies that don't need it. And we have heard today that there are some people for whom the tax increase is not a burden as it is for other individuals and for businesses. We also talked about the schools. And I think we've discussed, particularly those of us on the school liaison committee, that even though it appears the elementary, well, first of all, what year were we planning on starting to fund the new elementary school if it had been approved by the county?
I think it was 23 originally.
So it wasn't FY22 in any way.
No.
It had already been pushed out. And at this point, it may not be an elementary school, but there is still going to be capital improvement needs from the schools. I think there's a big push right now for pre-K.
That's right.
So, so those were sort of the questions I have. Do you mind if I make my comments at the same time? So I've given this a lot of thought, and I'm going to read some. This is going to be a little long, but that's okay. So after, I really appreciate everyone coming in and giving their opinions and their thoughts, and I'm not insensitive to people's concerns with the tax increase and the use of an ARP, but I'd like to share a little different approach based on some things that we have received from different ones. It's not about numbers, it's more about a philosophy. So this came from a resident after our May meeting. And when we knew that we were going to get significant ARP funding, we didn't know exactly how much, but we knew then that we were going to get ARP funding in May. I am writing to urge you to make the hard decision and vote the real estate tax increase City Manager Trivett has requested and justified. You've heard all the arguments pro and con. I won't rehearse them here. However, you might ask yourselves when the last time was that you heard a proposed tax increase greeted with enthusiasm, or whether the arguments against our last increase were really so very different from the ones you're hearing against this one. Or perhaps most significantly, when seen in retrospect, whether that last increase really did prove unnecessary, whether we could have done without the expenses it enabled. And if so, which ones would you now call needlessly extravagant? As our city comes out of this pandemic, the goal needs to be restore the best of life as it was, but also lay the basis for a future as good as our pre-COVID past. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that this will happen as a matter of course. 10 years on the Williamsburg-James City County School Board reinforced my awareness again and again that hope is not a plan and neither is assumption. The means to make the recovery what we want need to be there, and providing for that need is up to you, up to us city council members. Williamsburg will not be as special best it can be without investment. Making hard choices now to set us up for recovery is what's needed. Then we heard from another resident who has never been in favor of a tax increase, and he says here, when the 68-cent tax proposal was announced, my reaction was that it was unprecedented and unacceptable. Having now spent time reviewing, listening, and discussing, I find I can fully support the 68 rate. In fact, I think the 66 cents is not acceptable. He says, I believe council has used poor judgment to request support a more aggressive and optimistic approach. May 2021 is playing the same as May 20 when we were assured of getting back to normal by September. And I share these comments because they're from citizens who have taken the time to follow the budget process throughout. Upon receipt of the city manager's letter, they read it, they asked questions, they watched the proceedings, they educated themselves, and they made a determination based on facts. Budget has been researched, prepared, and well thought through for the benefit of the city by professionals. And as I said before, none of us fit into that category of being budget professionals. So I'm a little concerned that residents who are listening to what a few non-professional individuals want you to hear and adopt, I consider detrimental to the best interest of the city. And I question how many of you who have spoken out today have undertaken to fully understand, how many used the balance tool that was available on our city council budget webpage, contacted the city manager with questions to understand exactly what is involved. When I joined council, I had no idea about the budget. I didn't realize that it was going to be this big fat book that I was supposed to understand. I didn't realize that there was a budget message that came with it and gave the summary of the budget. Nor did I understand that as important as it is to take care of the basic needs for our residents, it's more important that the budget provide a vehicle for our GIOs, our goals, initiatives, and outcomes, which we all voted on back in the fall. This is the roadmap for the city, and part of what makes us special and sets us apart from other communities. Not moving forward on our GIOs keeps us static and is, again, detrimental to the city. Some say wait for the economy, which for us is tourism, to improve, but look what happened when we waited for tourism to return. It didn't, and our tourism tax revenue declined such that we are now more dependent on real estate taxes. Finance Manager, Director Dameron mentioned a chart, which I think Mayor Hans will remember quite well. And it's curious that in FY 2004, we had more room taxes and more meals taxes combined than we are projecting for FY 22. So we have seen a decline. If you can see this, the white number is meals and rooms taxes, and it dipped way down in the recession, and it's come back, but we are not surpassing what our real estate taxes are. And the only way we're going to do that is to invest in product and promotion and the city. I was in, we've lost out to other cities, particularly I was in Asheville last weekend, Memorial Day weekend, and you couldn't buy a reservation at a restaurant. We probably tried 6 of them. We stayed at a hotel, and it was not a great hotel, but they were able to demand $350 a night because they were on Biltmore Avenue, downtown Asheville. And due to the TDF and the Tourism Council, we're seeing small signs of recovery due to promotion and promise of product. Restaurants and attraction business won't return without product or promotion to bring people and more money for businesses and workers, and to attract those workers because they want amenities. They don't want the same old, same old. I was at the Another Broken Egg Cafe ribbon cutting this morning. A lot of people were there, and I asked the owner, why now? Why not wait? Or why not do the easy thing and just reopen as an IHOP? And he said he wanted to invest now in something new. To be honest, who cares about an IHOP anyway? And he didn't want the building to be empty. He wanted something fresh and he wanted something new. We have to broaden our product to bring new and more people here. Everyone saw in Asheville and told me, when I told them I'd been from Williamsburg, they said, yeah, I love the area, went as a child, my parents took me, but they never returned. And we need to change the narrative, and we won't be able to do it without investment. We need to flip this revenue such that the meals and room tax comes back and exceeds real estate taxes so we don't have a dependency on them like we did then. Some say that we're already back and that revenue projections should be higher to account for the need of a tax increase, and we've just said that even with higher projections, we're still at a deficit. Then there's the camp that looks at the ARP as our savior, the golden egg to balance the budget this year, but that's not the intent of the plan. Everything I've read coincides with what Davenport and others have suggested. Not only is there a suggestion to avoid making quick decisions on interpretation, but also to deliberate for the best long-term results. And even though I have not read the entire 150 pages from Treasury, I have pulled out a lot of things. I mean, Google gives you a lot of stuff that you can bring, and I urge residents who are questioning what the intent of the ARP is to do some of this. The U.S. Department of Treasury has a fact sheet. The American Rescue Plan will deliver immediate economic relief to families, and it talks about all the different funds that are going to be available, including state and local fiscal recovery fund, and it will provide needed relief to state, local, and tribal governments to enable them to continue to support the public health response and lay the foundation for a strong and equitable economic recovery. Then there was an article in the Daily Press a few months ago about tackle regional priorities with relief money. Use it to help expand, finish expanding I-64, complete the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. So one thought is that, I think what's the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats, and prioritize initiatives that help those most harmed as a result of the pandemic. Unique opportunity to make once-in-a-generation investments with broad public benefit. Then I found this one last night called Every Nevadan Recovery Framework. And they've done a great job. Nevada has an 8-page program for the state, but they've really laid it out and recognized that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity unique opportunity to not only begin to recover from the devastating impacts, but to build a stronger, more resilient Nevada that expands economic opportunities, blah, blah, blah. And then there's another fact sheet from Department of Treasury. And again, the same intent, that this is for long-term transformational changes, not to put the money and budget it for 1 year. Then there was an article in the Daily Press yesterday, Helping the Least of Us Serves All of Us, and it was by Steve Cass, the United Way of Virginia Peninsula president. And he was just talking about that the strength of the Virginia economy is inextricably tied to the financial stability of its residents. The more people who participate in the economy, the stronger it will be. And I don't think that people realize that we have a lot of those residents who struggle in Williamsburg. We have 30% of free and reduced lunches at our schools. We have 12% who have a food insecurity. We have many who are homeless in school. And the ARP provides a way that we might be able to address some of those. Then there's a long article from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities talking about where they think the money should be spent. But all of them talk about affecting infusion to meet pandemic responses and build a stronger, more equitable economy. So I think about some of the things that City Manager Trivett said and look at ways that we could enact and make those changes in our community. And to me, one of the most promising and exciting is to tackle affordable housing. Having been on the Neighborhood Balance Committee and on the Affordable Housing Committee now, which are all key to residents across the board, and on both of them, the strategies, the recommendations, the concepts that we discussed and put forward require funding, whether it be a land trust, whether it be a grant for preserving remaining affordable housing neighborhoods such as Highland Park, whether it means to help stabilize housing, rent assistance for the most vulnerable and the lowest income, a home maintenance fund to help maintain aging in place, Capitol Landing Road, transform that into a mixed-use, mixed-income project with some of the lands that the city owns. Even for William and Mary, young faculty and staff that no longer can have a difficulty living close to town. Initiatives that we discussed require funding, and the ARP could put a significant dent into some of those. Assistance for whom the additional real estate tax is really a burden, as we suggested. A bridge to home to provide stability and homeless and to help them get out of that. So I calculated the increase in my real estate taxes for both my residence and my rental property. For the former, a 6-cent increase translates to $487 this year, which sounds like a lot, but when I break it down, it's $41 a month, it's $10 a week, it's $1.35 a day. I'm willing to cut that amount of minor discretionary spending to enact some really, truly transformational changes to those who have been most impacted. And I hope others will as well. For my rental property, it'd be an increase of $7 per tenant per month, and I don't consider that a hardship for them. The ARP, which we won't receive this month, provides the opportunity to make changes for so many and to help Williamsburg prepare for the next emergency, because it will come. It will also help us be the city that we think we are. And I've got two other things. Sorry to be so long, but I was doing my COVID cleaning, and I found an article that it was an email someone sent me when I was running for council back in 2016. And she was giving me some ideas of what I should focus on. And just some excerpts. Williamsburg has been an incredibly fortunate city for decades. The fact is it has no major egregious problems. But eventually maintaining Williamsburg's status quo is simply unrealistic. There is a need for an immeasurable value of preparedness. By that I mean preparedness with a capital P. Being sure the city is as ready as possible from change from without, not just within. Any community in its government that perennially focuses inward is ill-prepared for any change it doesn't generate itself. Everything becomes an emergency or a crisis. Bad decisions inevitably are made and must be unraveled. Time and resources are lost over and over. This is 2016. Is Williamsburg now in a position to expect the unexpected? Is city government agile enough to react and respond to whatever may come? These are hard questions and ones that have an edge to them, but they also speak to issues each and every one of us wrestles with. And then she goes on to say, Williamsburg is a nice town. The college is nice, CW is nice, people are nice, and most in-town businesses are nice, all of which makes Williamsburg very vulnerable to complacency. Perhaps it's time for some little straight talk, that we need to make some hard decisions. And the same resident who spoke, who I referenced earlier, said that his concern is taking 66 cents is the ongoing impact on our reserves. Reserves are for unknowns and surprises. COVID-19 is no longer a surprise, and if we think objectively, it's now not a significant unknown either. The next pandemic shouldn't be a surprise and may well be a worse impact. We should anticipate that sooner rather than later. Not because it may happen sooner, because planning for the unexpected is what fiduciary responsibility means. So I just feel that the ARP's intent is a little broader than the focus that has been suggested. And even though we're a small town, we have big visions. We have big views, and I think we owe it to ourselves to maintain that viewpoint. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Councilwoman Ramsey, that was very well said and well researched, so appreciate your comments and everyone, and of course those who have come to speak today. I have a few questions and then we'll share some of my comments as well. The first is, the real difficulty we have here is not having ARP funding at the moment and not knowing the limitations on it once we do. So I have seen some lists, the IFR, the interim final rule, which is a bit of an oxymoron, that say, here's what's allowable, but this list isn't exclusive. Compared to maybe what we were allowable to do from CARES Act, do you think that the ARP will strictly be allowed for large in CIP projects, or are there opportunities for some flexibility for localities to specify, or I'm sorry, for localities to use best the funds as they see fit?
I think that the challenge is that the wording that's currently in the interim rule is, it's sort of doublespeak in that, you read one paragraph and it says this is intended to provide lots of latitude for local governments, and then you get into very restrictive language about how it can be used and can't be used, and then immediately following that is language that says, but this is not an exclusive list, and we intend for localities to be able to plan for major projects. I think Mr. Maslin referenced the National League of Cities. Well, we were looking at their website today and discovered that in one of the segments they have published about how you can use the ARP, they misplaced a period. And I don't know if you're familiar with internet memes. A very popular internet meme is if you move that comma from one place to another, how the sentence completely changes. And so from the IRF to the National League of Cities publication, the intent is drastically different. So I don't have a good answer for you. I think that the best thing that we can do, maybe Mr. Sanderson can offer more, I think the best thing that we can do is adopt a budget based on what we know our need is now and adjust that budget based on what the council decides is the best policy decision for applying that ARP when we have more certainty about the best and highest use of the money. It's extremely rare that a locality, I think one of the council members said earlier today, wins the lottery and receives what might be $18 million that's intended to satisfy those long-term visionary goals that we've talked about and identified that it may take 50 years for Williamsburg to accomplish that. Well, this money could mean accomplishing it in 5. But in order to achieve that, we've got to be very strategic and deliberate about where we apply the funding. That's not to say it's exclusive. That's not to say we can't use some of it to fix a budget hole today and plan for the bulk of it to be applied in that visionary way. But it does mean that we need to be very careful about making those long-term decisions, particularly knowing there's a deficiency in the budget that will not be fixed by one-time revenues.
So to the point of when we might get that the lottery winning, so to speak, I didn't recognize that August was a potential, and I recognize it's coming in 2 different tranches. Obviously, there's no exact certainty on when it will hit the bank, but what has the guidance been on when we may receive some of that funding?
So, until this morning, I was thinking that Mr. Maslin is right on his read of the regulation, that we would receive it much sooner than August. But a state official told us at the ribbon cutting this morning that his intel was it could be August. We're still waiting on the official guidance to come from the Secretary of Finance, Aubrey Lane. And when we get that, then we'll know for sure. We were told last week to expect it immediately, and evidently they have a different definition of immediately than we do, as we still don't have it. And I don't know if it will be this week or the next week. I'm not sure what's holding it up. I suspect it's uncertainty about, and the digging deeper into the weeds. The gentleman this morning from the Commerce and Trade office was telling us that the hiccup in this is the fact that when the CARES Act money came down, the General Assembly said, and actually passed a statute, I'm not sure exactly what it is, that says that the General Assembly gets to decide how to disperse those types of awards. And so here is another award that's being funneled in the same way as the CARES Act funding. And so I guess there's some question about, does the General Assembly have to meet to determine how to disperse it, even if it is the ultimate decision to be consistent with the guidance that's come from Treasury. And that's what we were hearing this morning. So I think the message there is, we don't know. It could be sooner, it could be later. It's going to happen. We're definitely going to get some money in the near future.
Okay. Last question, and this might be one that better posed to Jimmy, is obviously maintaining that AA1 and AAA bond rating is of the utmost importance to the city. One of the things mentioned in the variations is potentially pay-going the police department. If we don't do that, that would be 30 years of debt service, and we certainly don't want to incur more cost to the taxpayer. What level of ratio from reserves as compared to a general fund would maybe start to have a Moody's question their bond rating? And I know you said there's a trend line, so it's not 1 year if they hit a certain level, but what are some of the qualifications of putting that rating at risk for a city?
Yeah, there are, think of there's maybe 3 or 4 buckets that the rating agencies look at, and one of them is your liquidity and financial reserves, and I think that's 30% or so of the overall rating, the quantitative part of the rating. There's some other qualitative pieces that they still keep behind a black box that we can't get to, but the just math part of it is 30% of that. When we talked about it earlier, your sort of unassigned fund balance, which is one of the ways they look at it, because those are the monies that you can use for any purpose that you want, in particular these sort of rainy day funds. Your overall percentage there, I believe, was, I might have it here, I think it was like $14 million in just cash reserves. But as a percentage, it was much higher, even more so than other localities. Yeah, right here. Your unassigned, and this is from 19, changed a little bit maybe in 20, but not materially. You were at 30%. Your unassigned fund balance was 30% of your reserves. Other AAA localities are closer to 20%. Right, so that's where you get a little bit of, you have a little bit more cushion, and you need a little bit more cushion because you rely heavily on tourism revenues, and this is a perfect example of why that's the case. So you could have some movement in your fund balance, certainly, but what the rating agencies are going to start to look at is the trajectory, and so they look at a percentage of the change of your reserves over a 5-year period. That's factored into it, as well as just the fundamental, what's the level of your reserves. Now, there's other reasons why you have to have reserves, and that's just purely cash flow. You don't get revenue, and you're not paid on a biweekly basis like you are at a job. You bring in revenues at different times during the year. So you've got to have reserves just fundamentally to be able to balance your cash flow until you get to that next set of revenues coming in. So it's going to be the rating agencies looking at you and how you're changing year to year, and as you start to use that fund balance, and they see those percentages going, you're going to get some checks from them. You know, they're not going to immediately downgrade you. They're going to put you on watch, and they're going to say, we're seeing what you're doing. You need to fill those reserves back up, or you will be downgraded, absent some, really material change in your fund balance. So it's not black and white, but one where, in particular today, they're going to give you a little bit of time to see how it plays out. One of the policy things that we did recommend was you adopt a policy that says if we do drop below our reserve policy percentage, that you put a plan in place to fill that back up within a certain period of time. Mm-hmm. And the rating agencies are going to look at that and say, well, they've been fiscally prudent historically. We're going to give them that opportunity to now refill those buckets that they use for some emergency reason. So that's another important part of it, is if we do start to draw down our reserves, that we as a body and a city are going to find a way to then replenish them going forward.
Sure. Well, in the bond rating being at risk of a trend downwards, we certainly want to project the trend upwards by adopting policies like that. And I recognize Thursday, it might not be coming forward, but I think it's the intention of all the council to have something like that eventually. Similarly, for that reason, the characterization of the structural imbalance, I think, has been very well qualified. It's clear that is apparent. It's clear that from graphs that we've seen over the years, we have not been able to provide in our CIP fund at the level at which we would like to. I still have hesitations, though, about the timing of a real estate tax increase, not the actual levying of one eventually, but just the timing and it happening this year. And here's why. I think from the beginning of this effort, there's been the utmost wish to be as transparent as we can. Cities don't usually send out letters to all the real estate owners that they have in the city in the hopes to bring them up to speed about something, certainly if it's something that they might not be as excited about. I think when we first saw those go out, we had responses come back as people began to realize that this is something the city is considering. Half of those were usually in dissent, and half, surprisingly, were also in favor, recognizing that the city does need to address the structural imbalance eventually. And so as I became more aware of this conversation, as I learned about the budget myself, I found myself swayed in thinking as time has gone on, we've heard more comments from people who I think were not as up to speed about the budgetary considerations initially and are now wondering how could that impact my taxes that I pay this year? How could that impact my business if we're also dealing with supply chain concerns or concerns around labor shortages? And what I'm trying to keep in mind is people that we're hearing from are usually those that have a little bit more time on their hands. The busiest people who might not be as up to speed with the city's considerations might be those who are single parent or work in multiple jobs and don't necessarily have the ability to interact with this body more often. And I think of everyone who would incur the increase from this potential 6 cents, potential 4 cent increase, coming out of the pandemic, those who would be most affected either recently bought the home or inherited their home or might have the cost passed through to them on their rents are those who are also least prepared to meet it, as some people today have brought up. And while I think it's a great option, should we go forward with an increase that would have a grant attached to it, that would then essentially nullify the tax increase for certain individuals and certain businesses, I would worry about the time that might go into a resident or a business applying to something like that, and I would advise when that is created, if it is created, that it would be made as easy as possible to nullify that tax increase, as you would have to pay it first, as I understand it, and then would have that money remitted back to you. Last month, I think in the decision of this size, it was more difficult not knowing a little bit more about some of the revenue projections that we were going to see, and then also not knowing too much about the American Rescue Plan as far as when it may be received or the amount that it may be given to us. And so in delaying the vote, we've now gained a greater understanding from both of those, the revenues that the city will see soon enough, and that I think we're positioned to potentially increase, which I can get to later, and then also the American Rescue Plan, which is almost certainly at the $15 million mark, but potentially at 18.4, as we have mentioned. That does come with restrictions, and I recognize it must be very frustrating for city staff to read, we'll have great flexibility about this, but here's a more exclusive list around utility relief from a program that you can create. But it seems that the intention is to help communities get through this. I think we're still in the position of using a great deal of that lottery win to fund our long-term goals for the city while also potentially deferring a tax increase 1 year. If we went forward this year, let's say, of a 4-cent raise and that maintained next year, then we very well could also incur that same level by doing an 8-cent tax increase next year, which was the original proposal from staff, while potentially once we receive the funds in, let's say, August, being able to accomplish the CIP replenishment, the TDF replenishment, and rebuilding the reserve funds up to 35%, which is our goal right now. I think this, coupled with the pent-up demand for travel that we're seeing, could really put the city in a position to have a banner summer. That's certainly our hope. One of the things that I learned recently, understandably, is that our tourism chamber has a budget that it operates off of. And so over the last year in which travel has been negligible, that budget has not gone utilized as much as it would in a normal year. And so now Vicki, in a presentation that I understand the EDA saw recently, and I was hopeful to council to see soon, says she has a outsized budget and they are ready to spend it on enticing people to come to Williamsburg, which I think will put us in a better position from a revenue standpoint so that we might not be needing to see a tax increase this year. So I think that puts us in the position of being able to defer for a year, but I recognize that it very well may be the wish to go forward with 4 cents or 6 cents. And if that is the case, I think my utmost concern and recommendation would be, like I said, to make the grant as easy as it can be to an individual who isn't normally aware of city ongoings, or a business which has a lot of other things going on at that time, labor shortages, supply chain difficulties. And should ARP funds be less restricted, I would also wonder if we could be in the position to lower them this year if we're able to use them for more so than just CIP projects. So that's where I am today, and I recognize this has been a very difficult decision. I wish we had more information than we do right now. It's certainly my intention to want to see Williamsburg, for the community that we discussed in our GIO retreat of Williamsburg 2040. I think we're able to utilize small amounts of the ARP fund for deferring a tax increase 1 year, recognizing that it's very much so still a necessity, while also investing in some of the things that we could see position Williamsburg long term.
So I have a question. Kayla made a comment about utilizing the ARP funds, and you said a portion of them without a tax increase. So, City Manager Trivett, is that what, I mean, that we could use like 2 million of the ARP towards the budget and not have a tax increase, and then still have 5 million that we could help with affordable housing or school education or things like that? 2 million would, from the ARP, would balance everything else and not put us in a deficit?
I don't think the number is 2 million. I don't know what it would be. We would have to go back and look at that. But yes, you could split the funding up that way. I mean, essentially what the guidance says, in the way that it says it, is that we can use 9.2, is that what you said, for revenue replacement. Let's call it that. And that could allow us to, we could take some portion of that 9.2 and plug it into the budget to avoid the tax increase in this fiscal year, this coming fiscal year, and then still have, you know, a cache of funding available once we get it all to do some other projects or what have you, consistent with the guidelines. And, you know, that what we keep saying is the guidelines are not certain, and they're filling in the holes. The one thing that I would caution you is it's very clear from the guidelines right now that we cannot use this money to replace losses in the reserve, losses from the tourism fund, losses from the CIP that were used to fill the budget hole in previous fiscal years. That's very clear that we can't do that. And so we would need to be really careful about coming about that in a different way, because when this money is reviewed, we would not want to be in a position of then having to pay back some amount because we didn't do what the guidelines allowed. So we need to be very cautious about making decisions too soon, and let's see what these guidelines end up being in a final format, get all of the questions that the communities are asking across the country answered, and then I think we'll be in the position to make the best decision.
Considering just a 4 cent. But if we use this one-time ARP fund, really what we're doing is pushing back the burden that's going to come. And not only by using those $800,000 in this one-time measure, we're losing the ability to use those funds in a more productive way. So.
That's right, and I think, you know, the staff's concern is with that strategy of using the ARP to avoid a tax increase at all, is that it's very likely, we can't predict the future, but it's very likely that what you're doing is compounding the problem. It's not just postponing it, but compounding it, so that when we do come forward next year, the year after, and say, okay, we've got to raise taxes to fix this issue, it likely will be more than the 8 cents we proposed because we've lost time in terms of keeping pace with expense growth and revenue subtraction.
And I think that, as one person commented, no one wants a tax increase ever. So if we say, oh, let's just put it off next year, people will be more willing and more able to pay then. People are still not going to want a tax increase. So we're just putting off, as Mayor Pond said, the inevitable.
So moving forward into Thursday's meeting, where we have to approve a budget. State code says we have to, in order to operate the next fiscal year, we have to have a budget in place, and that has to happen Thursday. And in order to have that happen, staff has to have the budget documents prepared for us to vote on. And so far, what I think we have is two options, a 4-cent and a 6-cent. And if council wish to move forward on either one of those on Thursday, those documents are prepared. If you wish to have some other form of documents put together, we need to know today so we can give staff that direction so those options could be considered on Thursday. I think I heard, Vice Mayor, you wanted to see a budget of 0.
Yeah, I think I would like to see that option. I think, it's been, I don't know that that's the answer, but I would at least like to see that option so I can study it because, I use the word unprecedented, but at least in my 13 years associated with the city, this is the most feedback that I've seen from a proposed tax increase. In fact, in other times he commented, wow, where is everyone? Nobody's speaking up against the tax increase. So I think that speaks to the impact and the volume of the impact that people have suffered through the pandemic. So I would at least like to have that option to consider. For me, speaking for me, I would like to see that option to consider. And I have all the comments made by Mr. Sanderson and Mr. Trivett, maybe why we shouldn't do that, but at least I have the opportunity to study that before I make a decision on Thursday and weigh all of the comments from the citizens that we've heard.
I think it's a little curious that we've only heard really from one neighborhood today. I would have thought that some of the more modest neighborhoods most likely to have a little greater struggles might have either sent in emails or called the city manager. And for my question as city manager, you haven't had any direct calls from citizens questioning how the budget was determined or the tax or anything else. So
I've talked to a lot of people in person.
Right.
But not on the phone.
And some of it could have come from the last word, and some other solicitation for people to express their opinions.
I think we've heard that more than one neighborhood.
Well, a lot of them are from off of the Jamestown Road neighborhood.
I would also just say quickly, there are usual neighborhoods that I think are signed up for the city's newsletters. They're up to speed with our conversations. So just what is planned or what is under consideration, I think has a deeper impact in certain areas. I too would want to see an option on Thursday to consider of a 0-cent raise. The point was brought up earlier, though, that I recognize that budget may not look very pretty and may have a lot of red in it because in looking over the next 5 years, that difficulty does compound. But I think that option would be good to see.
So, right, we have, so if we prepare a 0 increase option for you, it sounds like what you want us to do is just leave the budget as is in terms of what's included and balance that reduced revenue by additional draw out of the reserve. Just because I want to be clear, we show you what you want to see. Okay.
Because that's the only money we have available right now to balance
Your
it.
two choices are to either take more money from the reserve to balance that loss of revenue from reducing the rate even further, or to cut expenses somewhere.
Yeah, and a question, Drew, I find very helpful the 5-year projection of where we may be with certain raises as opposed to others. This may be difficult, it may be impossible to project next year, considering FY 2023, where we are with the same consideration of the real estate tax increase. So as you bring back a budget that that is at 0 cents for this year, would that project into 5 years? And if so, could there be a consideration of what that would look like with a raise in the future, knowing that that is not of consideration on Thursday, but at least that the compounding read doesn't seem as if this is exactly what we're going to have for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think we can accomplish that. I think we can accomplish that. What you can't do, and I think Chris will say I'm right, you can't commit future councils to one budget or another. So we can show you that, but you can't commit on Thursday to raising taxes next year. We will have a very similar conversation to what we've had since February again next year, I have no doubt. But we will, I think we can prepare both of those scenarios, and we'll do our best to have it ready as soon as possible. I can't promise it won't be ready until Thursday.
And again, I don't say that's the answer, but I would at least like to say that I've considered that option before I decide. And I do want to say thank you to you and Ms. Dameron, because we've asked a lot through this budget process to go back and show us different numbers and answer a lot of questions. And that's helped me navigate through the process and reach a decision come Thursday.
So in preparing a zero increase, will you have to look to make those adjustments in the CIP, or did I hear correctly that we would support the CIP as it's laid out, but we would just dig into our reserve funds?
It sounds like that's what I heard from the Vice Mayor and Councilman Rogers. They want to see a budget that looks just like it does now in terms of the expense plan, and balance that loss of revenue of reducing the tax rate back down to its current rate using the reserve fund.
I agree with that. So it's sort of temporary until we actually get the funds, hopefully in a month, that then allows us not to have to use the reserves.
We hope.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, City Council communications. Basil?
We have a local emergency planning committee meeting on Wednesday. For me.
Schedule meetings, Mr. Trivett?
Yeah, so let's see. We have the roundtable for the EDA is on June the 8th, and the speaker is the city engineer, Aaron Small. So that should be a good one to tune into. Architectural Review Board meets on the 8th as well. On the 9th, the actual EDA meeting occurs. We're back at City Council for June the 10th. There's a Planning Commission meeting scheduled for June the 16th. June the 18th, the city offices will be closed for the celebration of the Juneteenth holiday. And then on June the 22nd, the ARB will meet.
Okay, so that takes us now to the open forum portion of the meeting. If there's anybody who would like to come forward to address council, please come forward and state your name and address, please.
David Cranbuell, 201 Harrison. I won't repeat all the rest of it. I must say I'm very uncomfortable with where you're going. It strikes me as you, especially Caleb, are suddenly really moved towards putting us at significant risk with clearly decreasing our reserves, which is exactly the path that's going to put us in a more financially precarious position going forward, which is going to result in an even larger tax increase next year and in following years. And I would simply ask that for the next meeting that you simply work with Michelle and make sure you come up with a grant program, regardless of what you do, that can pay and support any business that needs it in advance of any tax increase, if we are fortunate enough to have some reasonable tax increase, and provide funds for any widower or anyone else who needs tax relief or more money than beyond tax relief. Let's get that done for the meeting so that that aspect that you're worried about is resolved. And then I would really ask Mr. Dent and the rest of you to sort out 4% or 6% as the alternative, so the board is clean. We go into deficit with hopefully money that we are allowed to use to cover it, or we bite the bullet to minimize tax increases going forward, which will be even more ugly and unappreciated by those who don't want to pay taxes or have any whatever, that we agree on whatever it's going to be, 4%, 6.6, so let's get that worked out before the meeting. And then your meeting, we voted for you. I'm a little disappointed, Mr. Maslin, but he's been very good at analyzing things in the past, but I'm not with him this time. That we'll have a clean discussion of up or down. And I think then it'll be, an orderly meeting, and I appreciate all the time that each of you put in. And I think, we'll come out with something that'll work. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to come forward? Seeing none, I'll close the open forum, and I believe we have some items for closed session.
We do. I move to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments to boards and commissions.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.